Hello there, you're listening to The Planet's Memory, where time breathes and the Earth remembers. Close your eyes and imagine standing at the edge of an endless ocean where the waves whisper secrets that have been hidden for thousands of years beneath the darkest depths. The water stretches before you like a blanket of mysteries, concealing entire worlds that once thrived with laughter, wisdom, architecture beyond imagination, and civilizations so advanced that even our modern minds struggle to comprehend their achievements. Tonight, we embark on a journey that will take you beyond the familiar story of Atlantis, beyond the single lost continent that has captivated humanity for generations, and into a realm where the ocean floor itself becomes a graveyard of forgotten empires. What if Atlantis was never alone? What if beneath the surface of every sea and ocean there lie the remnants of other great civilizations, each with their own stories of glory and catastrophic endings? As you settle into comfort and allow your breathing to slow, prepare yourself for a voyage through time and water, through legend and emerging evidence, through the collective memory of humanity that refuses to let these ghost continents fade completely into oblivion. This is not just a story about lost lands. This is a story about us, about the fragility of everything we build, about the hubris that leads to downfall, and about the eternal human hope that somewhere beneath the waves, proof of our greater past still waits to be discovered. The night embraces you now as we begin this exploration, and with each word that follows, here you will drift deeper into a state of peaceful wonder, where the boundaries between myth and reality blur like the horizon where ocean meets sky. Let the gentle rhythm of this narrative carry you through realms both forgotten and imagined, through civilizations that may have existed long before recorded history began, and through the sobering realization that our own world might one day join them in the depths. We speak in hushed tones because these are sacred stories, passed down through generations in whispers and warnings, in myths that every culture shares despite being separated by vast distances and centuries of time. The ghost continents call to us from their watery graves, and tonight we answer that call with curiosity, respect, and the understanding that some mysteries may never be fully solved, yet remain endlessly worth pursuing. So breathe slowly, relax completely, and let your imagination sink beneath the surface with me as we explore the possibility that Atlantis was merely the most famous of many lost worlds, each waiting patiently in the darkness for someone to remember their names. The story of Atlantis begins not in the ocean, but in the mind of one of history's greatest philosophers, a man whose words would echo across millennia and spark countless expeditions, theories, debates, and dreams. Plato, the ancient Greek thinker who lived more than 2,000 years ago, wrote about Atlantis in two of his dialogues, works called Timaeus and Critias, and in doing so, he planted a seed in human consciousness that would grow into an obsession spanning every generation since. But Plato did not present Atlantis as a fairy tale or a fantasy created for entertainment. Instead, he framed it as a historical account, a true story passed down through generations, told to the Athenian statesman Solon by Egyptian priests who claimed to possess records far older than those of Greece. According to these ancient priests, Atlantis was a powerful island civilization that existed 9,000 years before Plato's time, making it incredibly ancient even by ancient standards, a culture that flourished when most of the world was still emerging from primitive conditions. Plato described Atlantis with remarkable detail, painting a picture of a continent larger than Libya and Asia combined, positioned beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow passage where the Mediterranean Sea opens into the vast Atlantic Ocean. This empire, according to the philosopher, was a marvel of engineering and organization, with concentric rings of water and land surrounding a magnificent central city, connected by bridges and tunnels that allowed ships to sail from the outer ocean directly to the heart of the capital. The Atlanteans possessed advanced metallurgy and worked with a mysterious metal called orichalcum, which glowed with a red light and was second in value only to gold. They built temples with gold-covered walls, constructed harbours large enough to accommodate their impressive fleet of ships, and created irrigation systems that made their lands abundantly fertile. Their society was prosperous beyond measure, with access to every resource they could need, and their military might was so great that they conquered many lands around the Mediterranean, even threatening Athens itself in a great war that would determine the fate of the ancient world. But prosperity and power brought corruption and moral decay, as it so often does in human history. The Atlanteans, blessed by their patron god Poseidon, and descended from the union between this sea deity and a mortal woman named Cleito, gradually became arrogant and greedy. They lost the divine qualities that had made them great in the first place, becoming obsessed with material wealth and military conquest rather than wisdom and virtue. The gods, observing this decline from their celestial heights, decided that punishment was necessary to remind humanity of its proper place in the cosmic order. Zeus assembled the gods to determine Atlantis' fate, and here Plato's account abruptly ends, leaving readers suspended at the moment of divine judgment. But from other references in his work we know the outcome. In a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, the entire island of Atlantis sank beneath the waves, taking with it all its inhabitants, buildings, knowledge, and glory. The ocean swallowed the continent so completely that it became impassable, thick with mud and debris, marking the spot where greatness had once stood. This story captivated the ancient world and has continued to fascinate every generation since, inspiring thousands of books, articles, expeditions, documentaries, and passionate debates about whether Atlantis was real or merely an allegory invented by Plato to illustrate philosophical points about the rise and fall of civilizations. Scholars have argued for centuries about the philosopher's intentions. Some insist that Atlantis was a moral tale, a warning about hubris and the corruption that accompanies unchecked power, nothing more than an educational tool wrapped in an engaging narrative. Others point to the specific details, the precise measurements and descriptions, the claim of Egyptian sources, and the matter-of-fact presentation to argue that Plato was recording a genuine historical event, even if some details might have been altered or embellished over the many generations of oral transmission before reaching him. The debate continues today with no clear resolution in sight, but what remains undeniable is the power this story holds over human imagination. Atlantis has become the archetype of the lost civilization, the standard against which all other tales of vanished cultures are measured, the symbol of both human achievement and human vulnerability in the face of nature's overwhelming forces. Yet as you relax deeper into comfort, consider this intriguing possibility. What if Plato's account, whether literally true or not, was actually describing a common pattern rather than a unique event? What if the story of Atlantis resonated so powerfully across cultures, not because it was entirely fictional, but because it echoed real collective memories of catastrophic floods and submerged lands that multiple civilizations experienced? Archaeological discoveries over the past century have revealed that sea levels have risen dramatically multiple times throughout human history, particularly at the end of the last ice age. When melting glaciers added enormous volumes of water to the world's oceans, flooding coastal areas where people had built settlements and communities, these floods would have been genuinely catastrophic for the people experiencing them, destroying their homes, drowning their cities, and forcing survivors to flee inland with nothing but traumatic memories and fragments of their former cultures. Could Atlantis be the most famous example of a much broader phenomenon, where dozens or even hundreds of coastal civilizations were swallowed by rising seas, leaving behind only myths, legends, and the occasional underwater ruin to prove they ever existed at all? Long before Britain was an island, before the North Sea existed in its current form, there stretched a vast landscape of rolling plains, gentle rivers, rich forests, and abundant wildlife that connected what we now call England to continental Europe. This land, which scientists have named Doggerland after the Dogger Bank fishing grounds, where evidence of it first emerged, was not a small strip of coastal territory, but an enormous region roughly the size of modern Britain itself, providing a land bridge that allowed both animals and early humans to move freely between the British Isles and the European mainland. For thousands of years during the last ice age, when much of Earth's water was locked up in massive glaciers and ice sheets, sea levels were dramatically lower than today, exposing vast areas of the continental shelf that are now submerged beneath shallow seas. Doggerland was one of these exposed regions, and it was not an empty wilderness, but rather a landscape rich with resources and ideal for human habitation, a place where hunter-gatherer communities could thrive among hills and valleys, along riverbanks and lake shores, in an environment that provided everything needed for survival and even prosperity. Archaeological evidence recovered from the North Sea floor tells us that Doggerland was home to humans for many thousands of years, with people living there from at least the Mesolithic period, around 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. Fishing boats operating in the North Sea have occasionally pulled up surprising finds in their nets. Ancient tools made of flint, bone harpoons used for hunting, fragments of mammoth tusks, antlers from deer species that no longer inhabit the region, and even the jawbone of a young man who lived more than 9,000 years ago, still bearing his teeth and providing researchers with genetic material to study. These artifacts paint a picture of an inhabited landscape where early Europeans hunted large game, fished in rivers that no longer exist above water, gathered plants from forests that now lie beneath sandy seabeds, and built communities in valleys that have been transformed into underwater channels. The people of Doggerland knew nothing of writing and left no written records, but they left their mark on the landscape and their artifacts in the soil, creating an archaeological record that only now, with advanced technology and careful seafloor surveys, are we beginning to reconstruct and understand. The end of Doggerland came gradually at first, then suddenly and catastrophically, in a pattern that might be familiar if we remember the fate of Atlantis. As the Ice Age ended and global temperatures rose, the massive ice sheets covering northern Europe and North America began to melt, releasing enormous quantities of water into the world's oceans. Sea levels began to rise inch by inch, year by year, century by century, slowly encroaching on the low-lying lands of Doggerland. The rivers that once flowed eastward toward the continent began to flood more frequently. Lakes expanded into marshlands. Coastal areas became increasingly vulnerable to storm surges and seasonal flooding. The people living there must have noticed these changes gradually, perhaps not even recognizing them as permanent transformations at first, simply moving their settlements slightly inland when necessary, adapting to the shifting coastlines and changing landscapes as humans have always done when faced with environmental pressures. But around 8,000 years ago, something happened that transformed this gradual process into a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, an event so devastating that it may have inspired flood myths that persist in European cultures to this day. Beneath the Norwegian Sea, an enormous underwater landslide occurred at a place geologists now call the Storegga Slide, where sediments on the continental shelf suddenly collapsed and tumbled down the underwater slope in one of the largest landslides in geological history. The volume of material that moved was staggering, estimated at more than 3,000 cubic kilometres of sediment, equivalent to roughly 3,000 cubic kilometres of underwater mountainside simply letting go and cascading into the deep ocean. This massive displacement of water generated a gigantic tsunami that radiated outward across the North Atlantic and the North Sea, with waves estimated to have reached heights of 25 metres or more in some areas, walls of water taller than most buildings, racing across the ocean at tremendous speeds. The tsunami struck Doggerland with full force, and the low-lying landscape, already compromised by centuries of rising sea levels and increasingly prone to flooding, simply could not withstand this final blow. The waves swept across the entire region, drowning forests and valleys, destroying any settlements that stood in their path, and permanently flooding areas that had been dry land for thousands of years. Survivors, if there were any in the hardest-hit areas, would have witnessed their entire world literally disappearing beneath the sea, their homes and hunting grounds transformed into open water in a matter of hours. After the Storegga tsunami, Doggerland never recovered. The combination of the disaster itself and the continuing rise in sea levels meant that what remained of the land bridge was fragmented into a series of islands, smaller and smaller as the centuries passed, until eventually even these were submerged, leaving only the highest points as shoals and sandbanks in what had become the North Sea. Britain became an island, cut off from continental Europe by water rather than connected by land. And an entire landscape with thousands of years of human history vanished beneath the waves, becoming a ghost continent that would remain completely unknown to modern humans until 20th century fishing boats began accidentally dredging up artifacts from the seabed. Doggerland joins Atlantis in the catalogue of submerged lands, but unlike Plato's legendary island, we have physical evidence, actual artifacts, scientific surveys, and geological records proving that this particular ghost continent was absolutely real, inhabited by real people who experienced a real catastrophe that drowned their world and forced survivors to rebuild their lives elsewhere, carrying only memories and stories that might, just might, have evolved over generations into the flood myths that appear in the folklore of northern European cultures. The discovery and gradual reconstruction of Doggerland through marine archaeology and geological research has profound implications for our understanding of prehistory and the possibility of other lost lands. If an area as large as Britain could be inhabited for thousands of years and then completely submerged, leaving almost no trace accessible to people living on the remaining land, how many other such landscapes might lie beneath the world's oceans? How many other communities experience similar fates, watching their lands gradually or suddenly disappear beneath rising seas, becoming refugees in their own time, seeking shelter in higher ground and carrying with them traumatic memories that would be passed down through generations as warnings and legends? The people of ancient times did not understand climate science or plate tectonics, whereas could not have explained their disasters in terms of ice ages ending or underwater landslides occurring, but they could remember that once there was land where now there is only sea, that entire worlds could be swallowed by floods, that the gods or nature could take away everything in moments. These memories, encoded in myths and legends, might be the only remaining testimony to ghost continents whose physical evidence lies buried beneath sand and silt in waters too deep or too remote for casual discovery. Halfway across the world from Doggerland, in the tropical waters between Southeast Asia and the islands of Indonesia, another vast ghost continent lies hidden beneath relatively shallow seas, waiting for marine archaeologists and geologists to fully explore its secrets and reveal what life might have existed there during the Ice Age. This submerged landscape is called Sunderland by scientists, and during periods of lower sea level, it connected the Malay Peninsula, Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and countless other islands into a single enormous landmass that more than doubled the size of Southeast Asia as we know it today. Sunderland was not a barren wasteland or an empty plain, but rather a region of immense biological and environmental diversity, with river systems larger than any currently existing in the region, including a massive river that some researchers believe might have been among the largest in the world, draining much of Southeast Asia and flowing across what is now the floor of the South China Sea before emptying into the ocean hundreds of kilometres from the current coastline. The importance of Sunderland extends beyond its sheer size and into the realm of human origins and the spread of our species across the globe. During the Ice Age, when much of Sunderland was exposed land, early human populations migrated through this region, using it as a highway for expansion from mainland Asia into the Pacific Islands, and eventually to Australia. The relatively easy passage across Sunderland, compared to the formidable water barriers that exist today, allowed humans to spread into regions they could not otherwise have easily reached, establishing populations that would later become isolated on islands when sea levels rose and cut off these migration routes. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans lived in Sunderland for tens of thousands of years, adapting to its tropical environment, developing sophisticated strategies for obtaining food from both land and sea, and quite possibly developing complex cultures whose details remain frustratingly beyond our current reach. Because their remains lie underwater, buried beneath sediment, or destroyed by thousands of years of marine processes. Some researchers have proposed that Sunderland might have been home to some of the world's earliest experiments with agriculture and settled village life, suggesting that the fertile river valleys and coastal areas of this now submerged continent could have supported dense populations and encouraged the development of innovative cultural practices. This theory is controversial and not universally accepted, because the archaeological evidence is limited by the difficulty of conducting excavations underwater, and because many proposed sites lie beneath modern cities and shipping lanes in Southeast Asia, making research extremely challenging. However, the logic behind the theory is compelling. Sunderland had everything necessary for agricultural development, including rich soils, abundant water, a favourable climate, diverse plant and animal species available for domestication, and thousands of years of continuous human habitation, allowing for cultural innovation and transmission of knowledge. If agriculture and permanent settlements did develop in Sunderland before the land was submerged, then much of what we think we know about the origins of civilization might need to be reconsidered. Because the earliest developments would have occurred in a region that subsequently disappeared, leaving later civilizations to independently redevelop similar practices without any knowledge of these earlier experiments. The drowning of Sunderland was not a single catastrophic event like the Storegga tsunami that devastated Doggerland, but rather a prolonged process that unfolded over thousands of years as sea levels gradually rose following the end of the last ice age. The process would have been slow enough that individual human lifetimes might not have registered dramatic change, with coastlines retreating perhaps only meters or tens of meters per generation, but over centuries and millennia, this gradual encroachment would have continuously displaced populations, forcing communities to move inland repeatedly, abandoning settlements and sacred sites to the advancing water. River valleys became estuaries, then bays, then open sea. Hills became islands, then shoals, then disappeared entirely beneath the waves. The largest river system in Southeast Asia simply ceased to exist as a river, its channel becoming a submerged trench on the seafloor, its former banks now separated by hundreds of kilometres of open ocean. The islands we see today in Southeast Asia are merely the highest peaks of mountains that once rose from vast lowland plains, and the shallow seas between them are the drowned remnants of a landscape that once supported vibrant ecosystems and human populations numbering in the thousands or perhaps even millions. The oral traditions of Southeast Asian peoples contain numerous flood myths and legends of submerged kingdoms, and stories that speak of advanced civilizations that once existed in the region but were destroyed by rising waters and now lie beneath the sea. While these myths were long dismissed as purely symbolic or imaginative stories, the scientific confirmation of Sunderland's existence has caused some researchers to reconsider whether these oral traditions might actually preserve genuine historical memories passed down over hundreds of generations. The Orang Asli people of Malaysia, Aboriginal groups in various Indonesian islands, and other indigenous populations have stories of ancestors who fled from lands now covered by the sea, of cities and kingdoms that sank beneath the waves, of a time when the islands were all connected and one could walk from place to place that now require boat journeys. These stories vary in details but share common themes of catastrophic flooding and lost homelands, suggesting that they might be cultural memories of the very real process by which Sunderland was gradually submerged. If these oral traditions indeed preserve historical information, they represent an astonishing example of cultural memory spanning 10,000 years or more, making them among the oldest continuous traditions in human history and demonstrating the power of storytelling to preserve information across countless generations. Modern technology is slowly beginning to reveal the secrets of Sunderland through seafloor surveys, sonar mapping, and occasional direct archaeological investigation of underwater sites. Researchers have identified what appear to be ancient river channels on the seafloor. It has traced the paths of extinct waterways and mapped the topography of the submerged continent with increasing precision. Some surveys have revealed what might be man-made structures, though confirming such finds is extremely difficult without direct investigation by archaeologists, and many potential sites remain unexplored due to the challenges and expense of underwater research in tropical waters, subject to strong currents, poor visibility, and heavy shipping traffic. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of Sunderland, gradually reconstructing a landscape and way of life that was completely forgotten by modern civilization until very recently. This ghost continent beneath the South China Sea stands as another example of how much history might be hidden beneath the world's oceans. How many chapters of the human story might have been literally submerged and lost, and how the conventional understanding of human development might be missing crucial pieces that lie beyond our easy reach. As you drift deeper into relaxation, imagine the immensity of what has been lost, not just in terms of land area, but in terms of human experience and cultural achievement. Thousands of generations of people lived their entire lives on lands that no longer exist above water, built their homes and communities in places that are now marine habitats, developed their cultures and traditions in environments that we can only partially reconstruct through scientific investigation. Their art, their stories, their innovations, their daily struggles and triumphs, all of this happened in places that we cannot casually visit, since that exist now only as seafloor features and occasional artifacts brought up from the depths. Sunderland reminds us that Atlantis, whether real or fictional, represents a broader truth about human existence. We live on a dynamic planet where the boundaries between land and sea are not fixed, where what seems permanent can become temporary, where entire landscapes can be transformed or erased by processes beyond human control. The ghost continents beneath our oceans are not just geological curiosities, but rather warnings and reminders that our civilizations are always more fragile than we like to imagine. Far to the south, in the southwestern Pacific Ocean, lies the most recently recognized ghost continent, a submerged landmass so large that it qualifies as a continent in its own right, but remained almost completely unknown to science until the late 20th century, despite being located near areas that have been explored by Europeans for hundreds of years. This is Zealandia, a continent roughly half the size of Australia that lies almost entirely beneath the Pacific Ocean, with only its highest peaks rising above the waves to form the islands of New Zealand and New Caledonia, along with a scattering of smaller islands. Unlike Doggerland and Sunderland, which were exposed during ice ages and then submerged by rising sea levels in relatively recent geological time, Zealandia has been underwater for millions of years, submerging long before humans evolved and therefore never serving as home to human civilizations. Yet its existence is profoundly significant for our understanding of how continents can be lost to the oceans, and for the realization that even in the modern era of satellite mapping and advanced oceanography, enormous geological features can remain unrecognized because they happen to lie beneath the waves. Zealandia broke away from the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana roughly 85 million years ago, around the time when dinosaurs still ruled the Earth, and began its slow journey into the Pacific while simultaneously subsiding, sinking lower and lower until most of its surface area lay beneath sea level. This subsidence was not caused by rising ocean levels, but rather by the continent itself stretching and thinning due to tectonic forces, causing it to lose buoyancy and ride lower in the Earth's mantle. Like a boat gradually filling with water and sinking deeper even though the sea level around it remains the same. The process took millions of years, with Zealandia slowly disappearing beneath the waves in a geological slow-motion drowning that eventually left only about 6% of its area above water. The submerged portions of Zealandia are not at abyssal depths like true ocean floor, but rather at relatively shallow depths for oceanic standards, typically less than 1 kilometre below the surface, confirming that this is indeed continental crust that has subsided rather than oceanic crust that formed in place. The recognition of Zealandia as a proper continent rather than just a collection of continental fragments was surprisingly recent, formalised only in the early 21st century, after geologists assembled enough evidence to make a compelling case that this submerged landmass met all the criteria for being considered a continent. It has continental rather than oceanic crust. It is elevated relative to the true ocean floor. It has a clearly defined area distinct from the surrounding oceanic crust, and it possesses a structure and geology consistent with other recognised continents. The main reason Zealandia was not recognised earlier is simply that it is underwater, and therefore not obvious from surface observation, hidden in plain sight beneath the Pacific Ocean, requiring careful analysis of bathymetric data, seismic surveys, rock samples and gravitational measurements to reveal its true nature and extent. This discovery has implications beyond just adding another name to the list of continents, because it demonstrates that our understanding of Earth's large-scale geological features is still incomplete, and that major discoveries are still possible even regarding something as fundamental as the number and distribution of continents. What makes Zealandia particularly fascinating in the context of ghost continents and lost lands is the question of what might have existed there had it remained above water. If Zealandia had not subsided, the southwestern Pacific would contain a landmass comparable in size to Greenland, creating an entirely different configuration of geography in that part of the world and potentially allowing for unique ecosystems and evolutionary experiments similar to those that occurred in Australia. When Zealandia broke away from Gondwana, it carried with it whatever plants and animals existed in that region at the time, including ancient species that would have evolved in isolation had the continent remained above water, potentially creating a biological diversity as distinctive as that found in Australia or Madagascar. Instead, these species were lost as their habitats submerged, and Zealandia became a submarine platform hosting marine life, rather than terrestrial ecosystems, a ghost of what might have been had geological processes gone slightly differently. But the story of Zealandia becomes even more intriguing when we consider that parts of it may have been above water much more recently than currently recognised, during the ice ages when sea levels were lower, and some of the currently submerged shallow areas might have been exposed as low-lying islands or coastal plains. Some researchers have speculated that these Ice Age exposures of Zealandia could have provided stepping stones for the human colonisation of the Pacific Islands, offering temporary land bridges or closer island spacing that would have made the voyages of ancient Polynesian navigators somewhat less daunting than crossing the vast open ocean distances that separate Pacific Islands today. This idea remains speculative and controversial, with limited evidence to support it, but it raises the tantalizing possibility that humans might actually have encountered, and perhaps even briefly inhabited, small portions of this ghost continent during the period when early peoples were expanding across the Pacific, exploring island after island in one of humanity's most impressive feats of navigation and colonization. If evidence of such human presence on now submerged portions of Zealandia were ever discovered, it would represent an astonishing archaeological find and add a human dimension to a continent that currently seems to belong purely to geological rather than human history. The study of Zealandia continues through scientific expeditions that drill into the seafloor to extract sediment cores, collecting geological samples that reveal the history of the continent over millions of years and providing insights into ancient climates, sea levels, and environmental conditions. These cores have recovered fossils of terrestrial plants and animals, confirming that parts of Zealandia were indeed above water millions of years ago and hosted complex ecosystems before subsiding beneath the waves. Each expedition adds more details to our understanding of this submerged continent, but also raises new questions about what else might remain unknown beneath the world's oceans. If a continent the size of half of Australia could remain essentially unrecognised by science until the age of satellite mapping and advanced oceanography, what other large-scale features might still be awaiting discovery? Are there other submerged continents that have not yet been identified? Might some of them have been above water more recently, and therefore potentially accessible to ancient human populations? Zealandia reminds us that the Earth holds secrets even at the larger scales, that our maps and understanding of the planet are still works in progress despite centuries of exploration and study. The existence of this ghost continent challenges our assumptions about what we think we know and encourages continued exploration and research into the submarine world that covers more than 70% of our planet's surface. For those interested in lost lands and vanished civilizations, Zealandia stands as proof that continents can indeed disappear beneath the waves, not through sudden catastrophe but through the slow, yet patient work of geological processes acting over vast timescales. While Zealandia's submersion happened too long ago to intersect with human history in any significant way, its example confirms that the concept of lost continents is not mere fantasy, but geological reality, and that the boundary between land and sea is more fluid and changeable than we typically imagine. As you breathe slowly and deeply, consider the implications of this. The understanding that the ground beneath our feet exists in a dynamic equilibrium that can shift over time, that permanence is an illusion even when dealing with features as massive and seemingly eternal as continents themselves. In the realm of hypothetical ghost continents, few have captured popular imagination quite like Lemuria, a supposed lost continent in the Indian Ocean that has inspired countless books, spiritual movements, and alternative history theories despite having no credible scientific evidence supporting its existence. The story of Lemuria is fascinating, not because the continent was real, but because it demonstrates how scientific hypotheses can be misunderstood, misapplied, and transformed into myths that persist long after the original scientific reasoning has been disproven. Unlike Doggerland and Sunderland, which are real submerged landscapes supported by solid archaeological and geological evidence, Lemuria belongs entirely to the category of imagined lands. Yet it deserves discussion in our exploration of ghost continents, because its story reveals something important about how humans process ideas about lost civilizations, and because it highlights the crucial difference between evidence-based archaeology and wishful thinking. The concept of Lemuria originated in the 19th century not from archaeology or ancient texts, but from zoology, and the attempt to explain the distribution of lemurs and other species across widely separated regions. Before the theory of continental drift was understood and accepted, scientists struggled to explain why similar or related species could be found on continents separated by vast oceans, with no apparent way for animals to have travelled between them. One English zoologist named Philip Sclater proposed in 1864 that a land bridge or continent must have once existed connecting Madagascar, India, and parts of Southeast Asia, providing a route by which lemurs and other animals could have migrated between regions before this land connection disappeared. He called this hypothetical landmass Lemuria, after the lemurs whose distribution patterns he was trying to explain. At the time, this was a reasonable scientific hypothesis given the limited understanding of geology and biogeography, and several respected scientists took up the idea and incorporated it into their own theories about biological distribution and evolution. However, as geological knowledge advanced and scientists developed the theory of plate tectonics in the mid-20th century, and explaining how continents move across Earth's surface over millions of years, the need for a hypothetical land bridge like Lemuria disappeared completely. Scientists came to understand that the distribution patterns that had puzzled earlier researchers could be explained by continental drift. The continents were once joined together in different configurations, allowing species to spread across large areas before the continents separated and drifted to their current positions, isolating populations that then evolved independently in their respective regions. The seafloor of the Indian Ocean has been extensively mapped and surveyed, and there is no evidence whatsoever of a submerged continent in the locations where Lemuria was proposed to have existed. The geology of the region simply does not support the existence of such a landmass, either currently submerged or having existed in the past and subsequently sinking. From a scientific standpoint, Lemuria was thoroughly debunked and discarded as a hypothesis more than half a century ago, relegated to the historical footnotes of scientific ideas that were once taken seriously but proved to be incorrect. Yet Lemuria did not disappear from popular consciousness the way it disappeared from scientific literature, because by the time it was debunked scientifically, the idea had already been adopted and transformed by various spiritual movements, alternative historians and writers of speculative literature who found the concept of a lost Indian Ocean continent too romantically appealing to abandon. Prominent among these was Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophy movement, who in the late 19th century incorporated Lemuria into her elaborate esoteric cosmology, claiming it was home to an ancient root race of spiritually advanced beings who existed in humanity's distant past. Blavatsky's Lemuria bore little resemblance to Sclater's original zoological hypothesis, and instead became a mystical civilization of superhuman beings who possessed advanced psychic powers and spiritual knowledge far exceeding anything known to modern humanity. Her ideas influenced numerous other writers and spiritual teachers who further elaborated the Lemuria myth, adding details about its culture, technology, inhabitants, and catastrophic destruction, creating an entire alternative history that exists completely outside of any archaeological or geological evidence. The persistence of Lemuria in popular culture, despite its complete lack of scientific support, highlights an interesting aspect of human psychology. We are deeply attracted to stories of lost civilizations and ancient wisdom, sometimes to the point where we prefer romantic myths over mundane reality. The idea that advanced civilizations might have existed long ago and then vanished, leaving only fragments of their knowledge preserved in mysterious traditions and esoteric teachings, appeals to something fundamental in human nature. Perhaps our desire to believe that the past was more glorious than we know, that secrets and wonders remain to be discovered, that current civilization is not necessarily the pinnacle of human achievement. Lemuria fulfills this desire perfectly by providing a blank canvas onto which people can project whatever attributes they find most appealing. Spiritual advancement, technological sophistication, harmony with nature, psychic abilities, or whatever other qualities they feel are lacking in modern society. The fact that Lemuria never existed does not diminish its power as a myth and symbol, though it should certainly disqualify it from serious consideration as an actual historical entity. What makes the Lemuria phenomenon relevant to our exploration of real ghost continents is that it demonstrates how easily fact and fiction can become blurred when dealing with submerged lands and lost civilizations, and how important it is to distinguish between evidence-based conclusions and imaginative speculation. When discussing Atlantis, Doggerland, Sunderland, and other potentially real or definitely real submerged landscapes, we must be scrupulously careful to base our understanding on actual archaeological evidence, geological data, and scientific research, rather than allowing our natural attraction to mystery and romance lead us toward believing claims that have no foundation. The lesson of Lemuria is that wanting something to be true does not make it true, and that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Real ghost continents like Doggerland exist and can be studied scientifically, revealing genuine information about human prehistory and geological processes. Imaginary ghost continents like Lemuria exist only in our imagination and can reveal nothing except our own desires and cultural preoccupations. Learning to tell the difference is essential for anyone seriously interested in understanding what lands have actually been lost to the oceans and what human civilizations might have vanished with them. The Black Sea, that distinctive body of water bordered by Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Russia, and Georgia, holds secrets that reach back thousands of years into the depths of prehistory, and among these secrets is evidence of a catastrophic flood that might represent one of the most significant natural disasters experienced by early human populations, a flood so traumatic that it could have inspired the deluge myths found in numerous Middle Eastern and Mediterranean cultures. For most of the last ice age, the Black Sea was not a sea at all, but rather a vast freshwater lake, isolated from the Mediterranean and the world's oceans by the land that is now the Bosphorus Strait, sitting at a level more than 100 metres lower than its current surface. This glacial lake, sometimes called the New Euxine Lake by geologists, was surrounded by landscapes that supported human settlements, with people living along its shores and in the regions that are now submerged beneath its waters, unknowingly building their communities in areas that would eventually become part of the sea floor. When the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose globally due to melting glaciers, the Mediterranean Sea gradually climbed higher and higher until it reached a critical threshold, where water began to flow across the barrier separating it from the Black Sea basin. What happened next has been the subject of intense scientific debate, but according to one prominent theory proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the late 1990s, the initial breach of this barrier led to a catastrophic flood as Mediterranean water poured into the lower-lying Black Sea basin in enormous quantities. The researchers suggested that this influx might have occurred with the force of hundreds of Niagara Falls, a tremendous cascade that raised the level of the Black Sea dramatically over a relatively short period, perhaps months or a few years rather than centuries, flooding approximately 100,000 square kilometres of formerly dry land around the perimeter of the basin. The speed and scale of this flood would have been devastating to any human populations living in the affected areas, forcing rapid evacuation and the complete abandonment of settlements, farms and ancestral territories to the advancing waters. The Ryan-Pittman hypothesis, known as the Black Sea Deluge theory, was initially based on geological evidence, including the discovery of a distinct boundary in seafloor sediments, marking the transition from freshwater lake deposits to saltwater marine deposits, along with the presence of ancient beach deposits that now lie far below the current sea surface. The theory gained additional support from sonar surveys and underwater archaeological investigations that revealed what appeared to be ancient shorelines, river channels, and possibly even man-made structures lying on the seafloor at depths consistent with the pre-flood lake level. Some underwater expeditions claim to have found preserved wooden structures and other signs of human habitation in these submerged zones. Though the interpretation of these findings remains controversial, and not all researchers agree on whether they represent genuine archaeological sites or simply natural features that happen to resemble human constructions. Nevertheless, the basic fact that the Black Sea expanded significantly when it was reconnected to the Mediterranean is well established, even if the exact speed and catastrophic nature of the process remains debated. If the Black Sea flood occurred as dramatically as Ryan and Pittman proposed, it would have been an event of such magnitude that it should have left a profound impression on the human populations who experienced it. Survivors would have fled inland carrying traumatic memories of their world literally drowning, of entire landscapes disappearing beneath the advancing water, of the sounds and sights of the great flood that took everything they had built. These survivors would have settled in new regions, intermingling with existing populations or establishing new communities, and they would have told their stories to their children and grandchildren, explaining why they had come to this place, what disaster had driven them from their homes, and how the gods or fate had sent waters to destroy the old world. Over generations, these stories would have been refined, elaborated, and invested with religious and moral significance, transforming from eyewitness accounts of a natural disaster into myths that explained humanity's relationship with divine forces and the fragility of human existence in the face of nature's power. Some researchers, including Ryan and Pittman themselves, have suggested that the Black Sea flood might be the historical event that inspired the various deluge myths of the Middle East, including the story of Noah's Ark in the Hebrew Bible and similar flood accounts from Mesopotamian sources like the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a fascinating possibility, though it remains speculative and impossible to prove definitively given that the flood would have occurred roughly 7,500 years ago, and we have no written records from that period or even from several thousand years afterward. The earliest written versions of flood myths appear thousands of years after the Black Sea deluge, leaving a vast gap during which oral traditions would have been the only means of preserving these stories, with all the changes and elaborations that inevitably accompany long periods of oral transmission. Nevertheless, the correlation between the approximate timing of the Black Sea flood, the geographic location where flood myths are most prominent, and the details of those myths which often describe a catastrophic inundation that destroyed the old world, all combine to make the connection at least plausible if not provable. Whether or not the Black Sea flood inspired specific myths, it certainly represents another example of how landscapes can be dramatically submerged, taking with them human settlements and forcing the survivors to adapt to new circumstances and new homes. The seafloor of the Black Sea preserves evidence of this lost landscape, including fossilized freshwater mollusks that once lived in the lake and now lie among marine sediments, ancient river deltas that formed when the lake was lower, and rivers flowed across what is now the continental shelf before emptying into the smaller lake, and possibly archaeological remains that could tell us more about the people who lived there before the flood if they can be properly explored and documented. The preservation of organic materials in the Black Sea is actually enhanced by the unusual chemistry of its deeper waters, which contain very little oxygen due to the sea's stratified structure, meaning that shipwrecks and other wooden artifacts can survive for thousands of years in remarkably good condition, potentially including structures from the pre-flood period if they exist and can be located. The ghost landscape beneath the Black Sea reminds us that dramatic floods are not merely the stuff of ancient mythology, but real events that have occurred repeatedly throughout human history, particularly during the period of rapid sea level rise following the last ice age. Communities that were established during the ice age along coastlines that seemed permanent were indeed at great risk as sea levels rose, and many such communities must have experienced exactly the kind of catastrophic flooding described in myths and legends. The Black Sea is simply the example we know about in most detail, because its enclosed nature and the distinctive geological record make it easier to study than open ocean coastlines where evidence of flooding is more difficult to detect and interpret. As you relax and let these images flow through your mind, consider how many other such floods might have occurred around the world's coasts during that crucial period of climate change. How many other communities experienced similar disasters, and how many of those traumatic experiences were preserved in oral traditions that eventually became the flood myths found in virtually every culture on Earth. Beyond the complete submersion of vast landscapes like Doggerland and Sunderland, The world's oceans also hide numerous examples of individual cities and settlements that were swallowed by rising waters or sank due to geological processes such as earthquakes and subsidence. The Mediterranean Sea, cradle of Western civilization and home to countless ancient cultures over the millennia, contains particularly rich evidence of such submerged settlements, with underwater archaeologists discovering remnants of harbours, buildings, roads, and monuments lying beneath the waves in locations around the entire Mediterranean basin. These are not ghost continents in the sense of large land masses that disappeared, but rather ghost cities, individual settlements or groups of settlements that were drowned or destroyed, and now provide tangible evidence that the line between land and sea is neither fixed nor permanent, that what humans build with such effort and pride can be undone by natural forces beyond their control. One of the most extensively studied examples is the ancient port of Alexandria in Egypt, where significant portions of the ancient city, including the area around the legendary Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, now lie beneath the waters of Alexandria's modern harbour. The submersion of this area was caused not by rising sea levels, but by a series of powerful earthquakes and associated tsunamis that struck the region in late antiquity, particularly devastating earthquakes in the 4th and 8th centuries that caused coastal areas to subside and slip into the sea, taking with them buildings, monuments, statues, and entire neighbourhoods of the ancient metropolis. Underwater archaeologists working in Alexandria's harbour since the late 20th century have discovered thousands of artefacts, including massive granite columns that once supported monumental buildings, sphinx statues, fragments of colossal statues of pharaohs and rulers, building foundations, roads, and harbour installations that give us a remarkably detailed picture of what the ancient city looked like in areas now lost beneath the water. The discoveries in Alexandria are particularly poignant because they include elements of structures that were famous throughout the ancient world, but had been completely lost to history until being rediscovered on the seafloor. The Pharos lighthouse, built in the 3rd century before the Common Era, stood over 100 metres tall and served as a navigational aid for ships approaching Alexandria's busy harbour, its beacon visible for great distances across the sea. Ancient writers described it in terms of wonder and admiration, and it functioned for over 1,000 years before being damaged by earthquakes and eventually collapsing, with the ruins sliding into the sea over time. For centuries, the exact location of the Pharos was uncertain, and some scholars questioned whether it had ever existed at all, or whether ancient descriptions might have been exaggerated. The underwater archaeological discoveries resolved this debate definitively, recovering massive blocks of stone and architectural elements that clearly came from a structure of extraordinary size and sophistication, located exactly where ancient sources said the pharaohs had stood. Finding these remains beneath the water provided not only proof that the accounts of the lighthouse were accurate, but also valuable information about ancient engineering, architecture, and the maritime culture of the Hellenistic period. Similarly fascinating discoveries have been made off the coast of Israel, where the ancient city of Caesarea Maritima, built by King Herod the Great in the 1st century before the Common Era, included an elaborate harbour complex, much of which now lies submerged due to subsidence and sea level changes. The harbour was an engineering marvel of its time, incorporating innovative concrete technology that allowed construction of massive breakwaters and docks extending far into the sea, creating a protected harbour where ships could load and unload cargo regardless of weather conditions. Over the centuries, geological processes and possibly earthquakes caused portions of the harbour to sink, with breakwaters, docks, warehouses and other installations gradually disappearing beneath the surface. Underwater archaeologists have mapped these submerged structures extensively, and they have discovered that the ancient harbour was significantly larger and more sophisticated than previously understood from land-based archaeology alone. The underwater remains include the foundations of Herod's palace, which extended out over the water, hydraulic concrete structures that still show the Roman engineering techniques used in their construction, and numerous artefacts including anchors, cargo containers, and personal items that fell or were lost in the harbour during the centuries when it was operational. The story of the submerged port of Pavlopetri, off the southern coast of Greece, adds yet another dimension to the catalogue of underwater cities in the Mediterranean. Unlike Alexandria or Caesarea, which sank in historical times and for which we have written records describing their original appearance and sudden decline, Pavlopatri is a Bronze Age settlement that dates back more than 5,000 years, making it one of the oldest known submerged cities in the world. The site includes the remains of streets, buildings, courtyards, tombs, and even what appears to be a network of channels or a water management system, all lying at depths of just a few meters below the surface in remarkably good condition considering their age. The preservation of Pavlopatri is enhanced by the sand that covers much of the site, protecting it from wave action and marine organisms that might otherwise degrade the remains. The city appears to have been submerged gradually by a combination of sea level rise and land subsidence, allowing its inhabitants time to evacuate and take their possessions, which explains why relatively few artifacts have been found among the architectural remains. The people simply left, taking what they could carry and abandoning the physical structures of their community to the sea. These Mediterranean examples represent only a small fraction of the submerged settlements that exist throughout the world's oceans and seas, but they illustrate important principles about how cities can be lost to water and what we can learn from studying their remains. Unlike the vast ghost continents that submerged long ago and left relatively little accessible archaeological material, these submerged cities often preserve extraordinary detail because they sank more recently and in some cases quite suddenly, freezing moments in time like snapshots of ancient life. The artifacts recovered from these sites provide direct physical evidence of how people lived, what technologies they possessed, how they constructed their buildings, how they managed their harbours, and how they adapted to coastal environments. Each discovery adds to our understanding of ancient civilizations and demonstrates that the archaeological record extends beyond dry land into the underwater realm, where preservation conditions can sometimes be superior to those on land where weathering, agriculture, and modern development often destroy or disturb ancient remains. For those fascinated by the idea of lost civilizations and ghost continents, these Mediterranean examples serve as tangible proof that cities and settlements can indeed be swallowed by the sea, that the phenomenon is real rather than merely legendary, and that archaeological science has developed the tools and techniques to study these submerged sites effectively. While none of these individual cases represents a lost continent in the grand sense of Atlantis, or the real but prehistoric Doggerland, they demonstrate the same principles at a smaller scale. Human settlements exist at the interface between land and sea. This interface is dynamic and subject to change, and when change occurs it can be swift and catastrophic, overwhelming human efforts to prevent or control it. The Mediterranean, being relatively small and shallow compared to the major oceans, and having been inhabited by literate civilizations for thousands of years, provides particularly clear examples of this phenomenon because the sites are accessible to researchers, and we often have historical records that describe what was lost. Other regions of the world, with deeper waters and less extensive historical documentation, undoubtedly contain similar or even more impressive examples of submerged settlements that have yet to be discovered or adequately studied. To understand the full scope of landscapes lost to rising sea levels, we must consider the continental shelves, those vast underwater platforms that extend outward from the continents at relatively shallow depths before dropping off steeply into the deep ocean basins. During ice ages, when enormous quantities of Earth's water were locked up in continental ice sheets covering much of North America, Europe, and other regions in the high latitudes, global sea levels dropped by as much as 120 to 130 meters below their current levels, exposing virtually all of the continental shelves as dry land. The area of additional land exposed during the peak of the last ice age was enormous, roughly equivalent to adding another Africa to the world's total land area, and much of this exposed shelf land would have been prime territory for human habitation, because continental shelves tend to be relatively flat, well-watered, and biologically productive, offering excellent conditions for hunting, fishing, and eventually agriculture. The people of the Ice Age did not know they were living on what would eventually become the ocean floor, and could not have imagined that the seemingly stable landscapes around them would be drowned by water. But that is precisely what happened as the Ice Age ended, and sea levels rose relentlessly. gradually pushing the coastline inland and reclaiming the continental shelves for the ocean. The transformation of these extensive coastal lowlands from inhabited landscape to seafloor occurred over a period of roughly 10,000 years, from approximately 18,000 years ago when the last glacial maximum occurred and ice age conditions were at their peak, to around 7,000 years ago when sea level stabilized near their current position, having risen by the full 120 meters or more that separated ice age lows from modern conditions. This process was not perfectly smooth or uniform, with periods of relatively rapid rise alternating with periods of slower change, and with different regions experiencing somewhat different timing depending on local factors such as the melting patterns of nearby ice sheets and regional geological processes that could cause land to rise or fall independently of sea level changes. Nevertheless, the overall trend was consistent worldwide. The sea advanced, the land retreated, and the people living in coastal areas were forced to adapt by moving inland, again and again over countless generations, always yielding ground to the advancing water. Imagine experiencing this as someone living during that period of transition, though of course no individual would have been aware of the long-term pattern because the changes occurred slowly enough that a single human lifetime might register only modest shifts in coastline position, perhaps a few meters or tens of meters of retreat that could be attributed to temporary variation rather than permanent change. But families and communities with strong oral traditions might have passed down stories, noting that the coast was once farther out, that islands once larger had shrunk, that certain low-lying areas once dry had become marsh and then open water. Over generations, these observations would accumulate, and the oldest members of the community might hear from their elders about landmarks and places that no longer existed, creating a cultural memory of landscapes lost to the sea. When particularly rapid episodes of sea level rise coincided with major storms or catastrophic events like the Storegga tsunami, the change could be dramatic enough to be experienced directly as disaster, creating traumatic memories that would be transmitted with special emphasis and emotional weight, eventually perhaps evolving into the flood myths that appear so consistently across human cultures worldwide. The archaeological evidence for Ice Age human occupation of continental shelves is naturally limited by the fact that these areas are now underwater, but what evidence does exist suggests that people indeed utilised these coastal lowlands extensively. Artefacts have been recovered from numerous locations on continental shelves around the world, though often accidentally by fishing boats and offshore construction projects rather than through systematic archaeological surveys, which are expensive and difficult to conduct underwater. Shell middens, stone tools, processing sites for fish and shellfish, and even the remains of dwellings have been found in some locations, confirming that people lived and worked in areas that are now beneath tens of meters of water. Some researchers have argued that Ice Age human populations might have been disproportionately concentrated in coastal areas that are now submerged, suggesting that our understanding of human prehistory might be systematically biased toward inland sites, simply because those are the ones still accessible on dry land, while extensive evidence of coastal occupation lies beneath the sea where we rarely look for it. This possibility has profound implications for how we understand human development and the origins of civilization, because coastal areas offer unique resources and opportunities that might have encouraged innovation and cultural development. Access to both marine and terrestrial resources, the need to develop boats and seafaring technology, the possibilities for trade and communication along coastlines that connect distant regions, all of these factors might have made Ice Age coastal populations more dynamic and culturally advanced than their inland counterparts. If this was the case, and if the most important cultural developments were happening in coastal zones that subsequently drowned, then the archaeological record as we currently know it might be giving us a distorted picture of human prehistory, showing us primarily the inland populations that were perhaps less central to the main currents of cultural innovation. This is speculative and difficult to test given the challenges of underwater archaeology, but it is a hypothesis worth considering, and one that might explain some puzzling gaps in the archaeological record, such as the apparent sudden appearance of certain technologies or cultural practices without clear developmental antecedents in the regions where they are first documented on land. The continental shelves, then, represent the largest category of ghost landscape, far exceeding in area all the specific examples like Doggerland or Sunderland, because every continent is fringed by these shallow underwater platforms that were exposed during ice ages and then submerged as climate warmed and ice melted. The North Sea conceals Doggerland, but is itself part of the broader European continental shelf that was exposed during the Ice Age. The South China Sea covers Sunderland, but is also part of the Southeast Asian shelf that extended much farther in all directions during glacial periods. The Gulf of Mexico, the East China Sea, the waters around Indonesia and Australia, the seas around Japan, the shelf waters off both coasts of North America, and countless other regions all contain what were once dry landscapes, supporting ecosystems and potentially human populations. The total area of these ghost landscapes is immense, representing roughly 30 million square kilometres of territory that transitioned from land to sea within the time frame of human history. A transformation so vast that it affects every coastline in the world and potentially displaced human populations numbering in the millions. This is not speculative ancient history from millions of years ago, but rather events that occurred within the last 20,000 years, within the period when modern humans were the only hominin species on the planet and were developing the cultural traditions and practices that would eventually lead to agriculture, cities, and recorded civilization. As you breathe deeply and relax completely, letting these thoughts flow through your consciousness like water flowing across ancient landscapes, consider the magnitude of what has been lost and the vast scope of human experience that occurred in places we can no longer easily access or study. The continental shelves hold secrets about our past that we have barely begun to uncover, entire chapters of human history that remain unwritten because the evidence lies beneath the sea rather than resting safely in the archaeological record on land. Every piece of coastline you have ever visited, every beach where you might have walked, marks the boundary between the familiar world we inhabit and the ghost landscapes that lie just offshore in the shallow waters, waiting for someone with the technology, funding, and determination to explore them systematically and reveal what human stories they have to tell. These are not mystical lost continents from fantastic legends, but real places that real people inhabited, places as real as the ground beneath your feet right now, simply located in a different vertical position than they were 10,000 years ago, now beneath waves rather than beneath sky. The southernmost continent, Antarctica, holds a special place in the catalogue of ghost continents because it represents a landscape that is not submerged by water, but rather buried beneath ice, hidden under an ice sheet so thick in places that it exceeds 4 kilometres in depth, concealing whatever topography, geology, and potentially biological remains exist at the rock surface beneath. This ice sheet has existed for roughly 34 million years, long predating human evolution and any possibility of human habitation, but the continent itself is much older. Having broken away from the ancient supercontinent Gondwana and gradually drifted to its current position at the South Pole, where the climate became too cold to support the forests and ecosystems that once thrived there. Before the ice came, Antarctica was a very different place, a landscape of mountains and valleys, rivers and lakes, forests of southern beech trees and conifers, inhabited by dinosaurs during the Mesozoic era, and later by mammals and birds during the early Cenozoic before temperatures dropped below the threshold where such ecosystems could survive. The transformation of Antarctica from a green, living continent to a frozen ice sheet represents one of Earth's most dramatic environmental changes, driven by the gradual cooling of global climate and the changes in ocean currents following the separation of Antarctica from South America and the opening of the Drake Passage and the positive feedback effects of ice itself, which reflects sunlight and thereby reinforces cooling in a self-perpetuating cycle. Once ice began to accumulate on Antarctica's highest peaks and plateaus, it spread outward and downward, gradually covering more and more of the continent, smothering the ecosystems that existed there and essentially removing Antarctica from the category of habitable land. Today, only about 1% of the continent is ice-free, consisting mainly of exposed mountain peaks, the transantarctic mountains that stretch across the continent, and some coastal areas where rock surfaces are steep enough that ice cannot accumulate, or where wind patterns keep areas relatively clear. The remaining 99% of Antarctica is buried beneath ice, making it a ghost continent of a different sort than those that have been submerged by water, but equally inaccessible and mysterious in terms of what the land surface beneath might look like and what geological features might exist there. Recent technological advances have allowed scientists to peer beneath the Antarctic ice using ice-penetrating radar, gravity measurements, and other geophysical techniques that can reveal the topography and structure of the hidden continent. These surveys have discovered that beneath the ice, Antarctica has a complex landscape, including mountain ranges as high as the Alps, vast subglacial valleys, some of which lie more than 2 kilometers below sea level, and subglacial lakes containing liquid water that has been isolated from the surface for potentially millions of years, and river systems that flow beneath the ice sheet carrying meltwater from the interior toward the coast. The largest of these subglacial lakes, Lake Vostok, is roughly the size of Lake Ontario and sits beneath more than 3 kilometers of ice, representing a completely isolated aquatic ecosystem that might harbour unique microbial life, adapted to the extreme conditions of total darkness, high pressure, and isolation from the surface world. The discovery of such lakes has profound implications for astrobiology and the search for life on other worlds, because if life can persist in these extremely isolated Antarctic environments, then similar life might exist in the subsurface oceans thought to exist on moons like Europa and Enceladus, hidden beneath ice shells in even more extreme conditions than anything found on Earth. But Antarctica's relevance to the question of ghost continents extends beyond just being buried under ice, because the continent holds evidence of past climates and environments in the form of ice cores drilled through the ice sheet, sediment cores extracted from the seafloor around the Antarctic coast, and the rare exposed rocks where geologists can study the continent's geological history directly. This evidence reveals that Antarctica has not always been frozen, and that even relatively recently in geological terms, within the last few million years, the continent experienced periods when temperatures were warmer, ice coverage was less extensive, and parts of the landscape we now see as permanently frozen might have been at least seasonally ice-free. Some paleoclimatologists have even proposed that if current global warming trends continue, Antarctica might eventually transition back toward the warmer conditions that existed in earlier epochs, though this would require truly dramatic climate change and would take thousands of years to unfold, representing a timescale beyond normal human consideration, but fascinating from the perspective of planetary history and the long-term future of Earth's climate system. For those interested in lost continents and the possibility of hidden civilizations, Antarctica has naturally attracted attention and speculation, particularly from fringe theorists who propose that the continent might have been ice-free much more recently than scientific evidence suggests, and that advanced civilizations might have existed there before the ice formed. These theories sometimes incorporate elements from various sources, including misinterpretations of old maps, supposed anomalies in satellite imagery or aerial photographs, and the idea that Antarctica might be the real location of Atlantis or other legendary lost continents. However, there is no credible scientific evidence supporting any of these claims, and the geology and ice core records make it clear that Antarctica has been essentially completely ice-covered for millions of years. Long before humans evolved, and with no possibility of human habitation during the period when civilizations capable of creating maps or building cities existed elsewhere on Earth. The speculation about ancient civilizations in Antarctica falls into the same category as Lemuria and other debunked lost continent theories, appealing to imagination but unsupported by evidence and contradicted by what we actually know about the continent's history. Nevertheless, Antarctica reminds us that continents can be lost not only through submersion by water, but also through burial by ice, and that large portions of Earth's land surface can become essentially inaccessible to normal exploration and habitation due to environmental changes. The continent also serves as a stark warning about the power of climate change to transform entire landscapes. Because what happened to Antarctica over millions of years as it cooled and froze offers a dramatic example of how different the planet can look under different climate conditions, and by extension, how vulnerable our current landscapes and environments might be to climate changes occurring in the opposite direction as the planet warms. The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica contain enough water that if they melted completely, global sea levels would rise by more than 60 meters, drowning countless coastal cities and creating new ghost landscapes as today's inhabited areas become tomorrow's continental shelf. Antarctica thus connects the past and the future of ghost continents, showing us both what can happen when climate change transforms a landscape over vast timescales and warning us about what could happen to our own civilizations if we fail to address the environmental challenges we face today. The Pacific Ocean, largest and deepest of Earth's ocean basins, covering more than 1/3 of the planet's surface, has naturally attracted its share of the lost continent theories, particularly the legend of Mu, a supposed continent that allegedly sank beneath the Pacific waves in ancient times, taking with it an advanced civilization that had supposedly spread culture and knowledge across the region. The story of Mu, like that of Lemuria, originated in the 19th century and was largely the creation of one man, Augustus Le Plongeon, an amateur archaeologist and photographer who worked in Central America studying Mayan ruins, and developed elaborate theories about connections between the Maya, ancient Egypt, and a lost Pacific civilization that he claimed was the origin point for all world cultures. Le Plongeon's ideas were based on his own idiosyncratic translations of Mayan inscriptions, which professional scholars found to be completely incorrect, and his theories were not accepted by the academic community even during his own lifetime. Nevertheless, his concept of Mu was picked up and greatly elaborated by James Churchward, a British occult writer who published several books in the early 20th century, describing Mu in great detail based on what he claimed were ancient tablets he had seen in India. Though no one else ever saw these tablets, and most scholars believe they never existed. According to Churchward's elaborate mythology, Mu was a vast continent in the Pacific Ocean that was home to an advanced civilization with over 60 million inhabitants who had mastered various forms of technology and possessed spiritual knowledge far beyond that of modern humans. This civilization supposedly existed more than 50,000 years ago and was the original source of humanity's religious and cultural traditions, sending colonists throughout the world to spread civilization to less developed regions. Eventually, according to the myth, geological catastrophes caused Mu to sink beneath the Pacific in a series of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, destroying the civilization and leaving only scattered island survivors who preserved fragments of the original knowledge in their traditions. Churchward identified various Pacific islands and indigenous Pacific cultures as remnants or descendants of Mu, essentially appropriating their actual histories and replacing them with his imaginary prehistory. The concept gained some popular following, particularly in the early to mid-20th century, but like Lemuria, it has been thoroughly debunked by geological science and is not supported by any credible evidence whatsoever. The geology of the Pacific Ocean basin makes the existence of a sunken continent like Mu completely impossible, because the Pacific floor is oceanic crust rather than continental crust, meaning it is fundamentally different in composition and structure from the continents, and cannot simply sink beneath the waves the way continental crust might subside under certain conditions. Oceanic crust is created at mid-ocean ridges through volcanic processes and gradually spreads away from these ridges, eventually being subducted back into the Earth's mantle at ocean trenches, completing a cycle that takes roughly 200 million years. The Pacific Ocean floor is relatively young in geological terms, with none of it dating back more than about 200 million years, and most of it considerably younger than that, meaning that there has never been old continental crust in the Pacific Basin that could have supported a continent like Mu. The islands of the Pacific are either volcanic islands created by hotspots in the Earth's mantle, like Hawaii, or remnants of island arcs created by subduction zone volcanism, like Japan and the Philippines, or in rare cases like New Zealand, fragments of continental crust that have been isolated but not submerged. None of these geological features could be interpreted as remnants of a sunken continent, and extensive geological surveys of the Pacific have found no evidence of any submerged continental mass that could correspond to Mu. What makes the Pacific interesting from the legitimate perspective of ghost landscapes, however, is the very real phenomenon of island subsidence and the existence of atolls and guyots, which are former volcanic islands that have subsided below sea level and now exist only as underwater mountains or ring-shaped coral reefs surrounding lagoons. Charles Darwin, during his voyage on the HMS Beagle, developed a theory explaining how atolls form through the gradual subsidence of volcanic islands combined with the upward growth of coral reefs, with the coral maintaining itself at sea level, while the island beneath slowly sinks, eventually leaving only the reef visible once the central island has completely submerged. This theory has been confirmed by drilling through atolls to reveal the volcanic rock beneath, and it explains the curious ring shape and structure of these islands. While this process operates at individual island scale rather than continent scale, it demonstrates that land can indeed sink beneath the Pacific, and it provides a scientifically valid mechanism for how this occurs through the cooling and densifying of oceanic crust as it ages and moves away from the volcanic hotspot that created it. The Pacific Islands have been inhabited by humans for thousands of years, with a remarkable Polynesian expansion across the ocean representing one of humanity's greatest feats of exploration and navigation, as people travelling in outrigger canoes discovered and settled islands spread across vast distances, from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the southwest to Easter Island in the southeast, creating a triangle of human settlement covering much of the Pacific. These voyagers and their descendants developed sophisticated navigation techniques based on observations of stars, waves, wind patterns, and bird behaviour, allowing them to sail to islands beyond the visible horizon and return home again, transmitting knowledge of routes and destinations through oral traditions and practical training. The cultures they established on remote Pacific islands were genuinely remarkable, adapting to isolated environments with limited resources and developing unique traditions, art forms, and social structures. However, none of these actual Pacific cultures had anything to do with the imaginary continent of Mu, and appropriating their real histories to support a false narrative about a lost continent does them a disservice by obscuring their actual achievements in favour of a fabricated prehistory. The lesson of Mu, like that of Lemuria before it, is the importance of distinguishing between imaginative speculation and evidence-based understanding. The Pacific does contain genuine mysteries worth exploring, including archaeological questions about the details of Polynesian expansion, the nature of societies on islands like Easter Island before European contact, and the extent to which different Pacific cultures might have had contact with each other or with the Americas. These are legitimate research questions that can be addressed through careful archaeological work, linguistic analysis, genetic studies, and interpretation of oral traditions. Creating imaginary continents and attributing magical abilities to fictional civilizations does nothing to advance our understanding of these real questions, and in fact often makes it harder to have serious discussions about Pacific history, because the topic has been so contaminated with fringe theories and pseudoscience. If we want to understand what ghost landscapes might exist in the Pacific, we should focus on the real phenomena of island subsidence, the very real changes in sea level that occurred at the end of the last ice age and affected coastal areas throughout the Pacific Rim, and the genuine archaeological evidence of ancient settlements on islands and coasts, rather than pursuing fantasies about sunken continents that never existed. Having explored various ghost continents from the past, both real examples like Doggerland and Sunderland and imaginary ones like Lemuria and Mu, we must now turn our attention to the future and consider what ghost continents or ghost landscapes might be created in the coming centuries if current trends in climate change and sea level rise continue unabated. The scientific consensus on global warming is clear and well established. Human activities, particularly the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, are increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, causing global temperatures to rise, and this warming is causing glaciers and ice sheets to melt, while also causing ocean water to expand through thermal expansion, both effects contributing to rising sea levels that are already measurable and accelerating. The question is not whether sea levels will rise, but how much and how fast. With projections ranging from modest increases of 0.5 metre or so by the end of the 21st century, under optimistic scenarios where emissions are dramatically reduced, to much larger increases of 2 metres or more under pessimistic scenarios where emissions continue at current rates or increase, and potentially catastrophic increases over longer time periods if major ice sheets in Greenland or Antarctica become destabilised and begin to collapse. Even modest sea level rise of 0.5 metre would have significant impacts on coastal communities worldwide. Because much of the world's population lives in coastal areas, and many major cities are located at low elevations, where even small increases in sea level translate to increased flooding during storms, saltwater intrusion into freshwater supplies, and erosion of beaches and coastal infrastructure. A rise of 1 or 2 metres would be considerably more serious, potentially displacing hundreds of millions of people from coastal areas, drowning major cities or requiring the construction of massive seawalls and other defences to keep water out, and effectively claiming large areas of currently inhabited coastline for the ocean. Bangladesh, with its low-lying river deltas, would be particularly hard hit, potentially losing a substantial portion of its territory and creating one of the largest refugee crises in human history. Island nations in the Pacific and Indian Oceans would face existential threats, with some potentially disappearing completely beneath the waves within this century if worst-case scenarios unfold. Major cities including Miami, New Orleans, Bangkok, Shanghai, Mumbai, Lagos, and many others would face chronic flooding problems that might eventually force partial or complete abandonment of low-lying areas. Looking further ahead beyond the 21st century, if greenhouse gas emissions continue unchecked and global temperatures rise by several degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the consequences become truly catastrophic in scope, potentially leading to the collapse of major ice sheets and sea level rise measured in tens of meters rather than just 1 or 2. The Greenland ice sheet contains enough water to raise global sea levels by about 7 meters, and while it would take centuries to melt completely, the process might become irreversible at certain temperature thresholds, meaning that even if we later reduce emissions, the ice sheet would continue to melt due to feedbacks and momentum in the climate system. The West Antarctic ice sheet is particularly vulnerable because much of it rests on bedrock that lies below sea level, making it susceptible to a process called marine ice sheet instability, where warming ocean water melts the ice from below, causing it to retreat and potentially triggering a runaway collapse. If the West Antarctic ice sheet were to collapse entirely, it would raise sea levels by about 3 to 5 meters, and if the East Antarctic ice sheet, which is much larger but currently considered more stable, were also to begin melting, the total potential sea level rise from all ice sheets combined could eventually exceed 60 meters, though this would require truly extreme warming and would unfold over thousands of years rather than centuries. A world with sea levels tens of meters higher than today would be almost unrecognizable, with coastlines completely redrawn and many areas of current human habitation becoming ghost landscapes beneath the waves, future archaeologists' puzzles and underwater heritage sites to be explored by whatever civilizations might follow our own. The Atlantic coast of North America would retreat far inland, drowning Washington, D.C., Boston, New York City and Philadelphia, while significantly reducing the size of Florida and turning much of the southeastern United States into an expanded Gulf of Mexico. The Mediterranean would expand, flooding the Nile Delta and other low-lying areas around its perimeter, drowning Venice completely if it had not already been abandoned long before due to more modest sea level rise. The Netherlands, much of which already lies below sea level and is protected only by elaborate systems of dikes and pumps, would become part of the North Sea, along with Denmark and large portions of northern Germany. London would be submerged, as would much of eastern England. The shape of every continent would change as the ocean claimed coastal lowlands and converted river valleys into deep estuaries and bays reaching far inland. The human cost of such sea level rise would be almost incomprehensible, displacing not millions but potentially billions of people from their homes, destroying agricultural land needed to feed the global population, overwhelming any conceivable refugee and migration management system, and likely triggering conflicts over remaining habitable land and resources. The economic cost would be similarly staggering, as trillions of dollars of infrastructure, buildings and productive land would be lost to the sea, requiring massive investments to relocate and rebuild cities, ports, transportation networks, and industrial facilities on higher ground. The social and cultural costs might be equally profound but harder to quantify, as communities with centuries or millennia of history in coastal locations would be forced to abandon their traditional homes and territories, losing not just physical space, but also the intangible heritage and sense of place that comes from long occupation of particular landscapes. The archaeological record of our current civilization would be split between sites on land that might survive for future study and sites in coastal areas that would become underwater ruins, puzzles for future marine archaeologists to explore and try to understand. Much as we now study the submerged Mediterranean cities and wonder about the people who built them, this future scenario is not inevitable, and the extent to which it unfolds depends critically on decisions made in the coming decades about greenhouse gas emissions, climate policy, and the transition away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy sources. If humanity acts decisively to reduce emissions and limit warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the catastrophic scenarios might be avoided, though even in optimistic scenarios some sea level rise is already locked in due to past emissions and the thermal inertia of the climate system. The question is whether we will create large new ghost landscapes in the near future, or manage to preserve most of the current coastline for future generations. And that question remains open, dependent on choices still to be made. In the context of our exploration of ghost continents, this future dimension adds a sobering note, because it suggests that the phenomenon of land sinking beneath the sea is not merely a feature of the distant past when glaciers melted at the end of ice ages, but rather a recurring pattern that could happen again, potentially within the lifetimes of people alive today or their children, driven this time not by natural climate cycles but by human-induced warming. The ghost continents of the future would be our own creation, memorials to our failure to act on climate change when we still had the chance to prevent the worst outcomes. Among the most intriguing and controversial pieces of alleged evidence for ancient advanced civilizations and possible lost continents are various old maps that appear to show geographical features or possess characteristics that seem anomalous given the supposed state of knowledge at the time they were created. The most famous of these is the Piri Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis, which shows the Atlantic Ocean, the west coast of Africa, the east coast of South America, and various Atlantic islands, including what appears to be part of the Antarctic coastline, despite the fact that Antarctica was not officially discovered by European explorers until 1820. The map has been the subject of intense speculation and debate, with some researchers arguing that it proves ancient civilizations possessed advanced geographical knowledge, possibly gained through exploration, or possibly inherited from even older sources, while mainstream scholars explain the apparently anomalous features through more conventional means such as compilation of existing maps, artistic interpretation, errors in projection and scale, and the tendency of people to see what they expect to see when examining old cartographic documents. The Piri Reis map is not a complete world map, but rather a fragment that survived from what was apparently a larger work, and it was compiled by Piri Reis from multiple source maps that he had available, including Portuguese charts, Arabic maps, and at least one map that he claimed was captured from a sailor who had sailed with Christopher Columbus. The map includes various notations in Ottoman Turkish explaining the sources and providing commentary on different regions, and Piri Reis himself makes no claim to have personally explored all the areas shown or to possess secret knowledge from lost civilizations. The controversy centres primarily on the bottom portion of the map, which shows land that some interpreters believe represents the Antarctic coast, specifically the coast of Queen Maud Land before it was covered by ice, implying that whoever originally surveyed this coastline did so before the ice formed, thousands or millions of years ago. This interpretation has been championed most prominently by Charles Hapgood, a historian who proposed in the 1960s that the map provides evidence for his theory of crustal displacement, suggesting that Antarctica was ice-free until relatively recently in geological terms because it was located in a different position before the Earth's crust shifted. However, mainstream scholars and cartographers have offered much more prosaic explanations for the Piri Reis map that do not require invoking lost civilizations or anomalous geological theories. The supposed Antarctic coastline might actually represent the coast of South America, extending farther south than its true position due to errors in scale and projection, a common problem in early maps that were compiled from multiple sources using inconsistent scales and before accurate methods for determining longitude were developed. Alternatively, the land shown might represent purely hypothetical or conjectural additions by the mapmaker, following a common practice in Renaissance cartography, where mapmakers would draw in expected features based on theoretical geography, even if no one had actually explored those areas. The practice of showing a large southern continent was particularly common, because ancient Greek geographers had theorized that a large landmass must exist in the southern hemisphere to balance the northern continents, leading to the concept of terra australis incognita, an unknown southern land that appeared on many maps long before Australia or Antarctica were actually discovered. Piri Reis might simply have been following this cartographic tradition when drawing the southern portion of his map, adding a hypothetical coastline that happened by coincidence to vaguely resemble features of Antarctica. Several other old maps have attracted similar attention from researchers looking for evidence of advanced ancient knowledge, including the Orontius Phineus map of 1531, which shows a landmass labelled Terra Australis in roughly the position of Antarctica, and with some features that enthusiasts claim match the actual geography of Antarctica's coastline and interior topography. Again, mainstream scholars explain these features as products of Renaissance cartographic conventions, errors, and artistic interpretation rather than evidence of actual ancient surveys of Antarctica. The Zeno map, allegedly based on 14th century sources and showing various North Atlantic islands including some that do not exist or cannot be definitively identified, has been cited as possible evidence of pre-Columbian exploration of North America by European navigators, though most scholars consider the map unreliable and possibly a hoax or imaginative reconstruction rather than an accurate historical document. Each of these controversial maps has attracted attention because they seem to show knowledge that should not have existed at the time, but in each case, careful analysis by cartographic experts has provided conventional explanations that do not require extraordinary claims about lost civilizations or anomalous knowledge transmission. The appeal of these controversial maps is understandable, because the idea that ancient people possessed sophisticated geographical knowledge that was later lost and only partially preserved in fragmentary cartographic sources is romantically compelling, and would suggest that human history is more mysterious and interesting than the conventional narrative proposes. However, the evidence must be evaluated carefully and critically, distinguishing between what genuinely appears anomalous and what can be explained through normal historical processes, cartographic practices, and the limitations of early map-making techniques. Old maps are inherently difficult to interpret because cartographic conventions have changed enormously over the centuries. Mapmakers did not always distinguish clearly between observed features and theoretical additions. Scales and projections were often inconsistent or poorly defined, and errors could accumulate as maps were copied and recopied with each generation of cartographers, potentially introducing new mistakes or interpretations. These factors mean that seeing modern features in old maps requires great caution, because the apparent matches might be coincidental or might result from flexible interpretation, where the viewer sees what they want to see rather than what is actually depicted. The broader lesson from the controversial maps debate is relevant to our exploration of ghost continents, because it illustrates how easy it is to construct plausible-sounding arguments for extraordinary claims when dealing with fragmentary or ambiguous evidence from the past. Just as the Piri Reis map can be made to seem like evidence for ancient knowledge of Antarctica, through selective interpretation while ignoring the many ways it does not match actual Antarctic geography, so too can fragmentary myths, legends, and archaeological anomalies be assembled into seemingly compelling cases for lost continents and advanced ancient civilizations if one is not rigorous about evaluating the quality of evidence and considering alternative explanations. Real ghost continents like Doggerland and Sunderland are supported by extensive geological evidence, numerous archaeological finds, and scientific consensus based on decades of research by multiple independent teams of experts. Imaginary ghost continents like Lemuria and Mu are supported primarily by speculation, misinterpretation of evidence, and the desire to believe in mysterious lost worlds. Learning to distinguish between these categories is essential for anyone seriously interested in understanding what lands have actually been lost beneath the oceans and what human histories might be hidden there waiting for discovery. To fully understand how ghost continents and lost landscapes come to exist, we must examine the various geological and environmental mechanisms that can cause land to become submerged beneath water, transforming inhabited or habitable landscapes into seafloor over timescales ranging from sudden catastrophic events measured in hours or days to gradual processes unfolding over thousands or millions of years. The most common mechanism, responsible for the vast majority of drowned landscapes we have discussed, is eustatic sea level change, meaning global sea level rise that affects all the world's oceans simultaneously, typically driven by changes in the volume of water in the ocean basins or changes in the capacity of those basins. During ice ages, enormous quantities of water are removed from the oceans and locked up in continental ice sheets, causing sea levels to drop by more than 100 meters and exposing continental shelves as dry land. When ice ages end and temperatures warm, these ice sheets melt and return their water to the oceans, causing sea levels to rise again and drowning the previously exposed coastal lowlands in a process that has occurred repeatedly throughout Earth's history, following the rhythm of glacial and interglacial periods. The most recent major episode of post-glacial sea level rise began around 18,000 years ago, when the last ice age reached its peak and then started to wane and continued until roughly 7,000 years ago, when sea levels stabilized near their current position after rising by approximately 120 meters total. This rise was not perfectly smooth but occurred in pulses, with periods of relatively rapid rise separated by periods of slower change or even temporary stabilization as climate conditions fluctuated during the overall warming trend. One particularly rapid pulse of sea level rise occurred around 14,000 years ago during an event called Meltwater Pulse 1A, when sea levels rose by approximately 20 meters in less than 500 years, equivalent to roughly 4 centimeters per year averaged over that period, fast enough that people living in low-lying coastal areas would have experienced noticeable retreat of the coastline within their lifetimes. This pulse was likely triggered by the catastrophic collapse of a large ice sheet, possibly the Antarctic ice sheet or one of the North American ice sheets, releasing enormous volumes of water into the oceans in a relatively short time period. Such rapid sea level rise would have been particularly devastating for coastal populations, flooding their settlements and territories with little warning and forcing mass migrations inland. In addition to eustatic sea level change that affects the entire world, local sea level can be affected by isostatic adjustment, which is the vertical movement of the land itself in response to changing loads on the Earth's crust. The most important example of this is glacial isostatic adjustment, where areas that were covered by thick ice sheets during the Ice Age were pressed downward by the weight of the ice, causing the crust to deform and sink into the underlying mantle. When the ice melts and the weight is removed, these regions slowly rebound, rising upward over thousands of years in a process that is still ongoing in areas like Scandinavia and Canada that were covered by the largest ice sheets. This rebound causes relative sea level to fall in the areas experiencing uplift, meaning that the land rises faster than global sea level rise can compensate, creating the paradoxical situation where some areas have ancient beaches now located well above current sea level, despite the fact that global sea levels have risen since those beaches formed. Conversely, areas around the periphery of the ice sheets, which bulged upward during the Ice Age due to mantle material being displaced from beneath the ice-covered regions, are now subsiding as the mantle flows back toward the rebounding areas, causing these peripheral zones to experience relative sea level rise faster than the global average. Tectonic processes can also cause land to subside or be uplifted, changing the relationship between land and sea at local or regional scales, independently of global sea level changes. Subduction zones, where one tectonic plate descends beneath another, can cause coastal areas to sink suddenly during major earthquakes as the overriding plate is pulled downward before springing back up in the earthquake itself, sometimes resulting in net subsidence over multiple earthquake cycles. The Japanese coast has experienced numerous examples of this, with historical records documenting sudden subsidence events associated with major earthquakes that caused coastal villages to be flooded or destroyed. Volcanic islands can subside as the volcanic rock beneath them cools, contracts, and becomes denser, gradually sinking as the crust adjusts to the changing density of the material, a process responsible for the formation of atolls in the Pacific as volcanic islands slowly disappear beneath the waves, while coral reefs growing around their perimeters maintain themselves at sea level. Continental rifting, where tectonic forces stretch and thin the crust, can cause large regions to subside, as happened with Zealandia, which subsided over millions of years as it separated from Gondwana, and the continental crust stretched and thinned until most of the continent was below sea level. Catastrophic events can cause sudden localized submersion through mechanisms like tsunami flooding, underwater landslides generating giant waves, or sudden collapse of land into underground cavities or karst systems. The Strega slide and associated tsunami that contributed to the drowning of Doggerland exemplifies this type of catastrophic event, where a sudden geological disaster caused rapid flooding that might have permanently submerged areas that were already marginal due to gradual sea level rise. Volcanic eruptions and associated phenomena like caldera collapse can cause entire islands or portions of islands to sink suddenly. With the explosion of Krakatoa in 1883 and the partial collapse of Santorini in the Bronze Age serving as historical examples of how volcanic activity can radically alter coastlines and island configurations in very short periods. While these catastrophic events are dramatic and can cause significant local or regional impacts, they are less important for understanding the creation of large ghost continents like Doggerland and Sunderland, which were primarily submerged through the gradual but relentless process of post-glacial sea level rise, affecting thousands of kilometres of coastline over thousands of years. Understanding these mechanisms helps us appreciate that the creation of ghost continents is not a single type of phenomenon, but rather encompasses various processes operating at different scales and speeds, all sharing the common result that land which was once above water becomes submerged and effectively removed from human access and habitation. The diversity of mechanisms also explains why different ghost landscapes have different characteristics, different states of preservation, and different potentials for archaeological investigation. Landscapes submerged gradually by rising sea levels might preserve archaeological sites relatively well, buried under sediment before wave action could destroy them, whereas landscapes submerged catastrophically might show more dramatic disruption with artifacts scattered and damaged by the violent processes that caused the submersion. Landscapes that subsided tectonically might preserve deep stratigraphy, allowing researchers to study long sequences of human occupation if they can access the submerged sites, whereas landscapes buried under ice like Antarctica are essentially frozen in time but completely inaccessible except through the most sophisticated drilling and remote sensing technologies. Each ghost continent or ghost landscape is unique, requiring different approaches for study and offering different windows into the human and geological past. The exploration and study of ghost continents and submerged landscapes depends critically on the developing field of underwater archaeology, a discipline that combines traditional archaeological methods with diving technology, remote sensing, and specialized techniques for excavating, documenting, and preserving artifacts recovered from underwater environments. Underwater archaeology has advanced tremendously over the past several decades, progressing from simple diving operations limited to shallow, clear waters to sophisticated projects employing remotely operated vehicles, autonomous underwater vehicles, side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profilers, and other technologies that allow researchers to explore depths and conditions that would be impossible or prohibitively dangerous for human divers. These technological advances are gradually opening up the submerged portions of the archaeological record, allowing researchers to investigate sites on continental shelves in deep water, and in challenging environments where evidence of past human activity has been preserved but remains frustratingly difficult to access. One of the fundamental challenges of underwater archaeology is simply finding sites to investigate. Because the ocean is vast and submerged, archaeological sites do not announce their presence the way sites on land often do through visible surface features like mounds, ruins, or artifact scatters. Systematic survey of even relatively small areas of seafloor is expensive and time-consuming, requiring ships, specialized equipment, trained personnel, and favorable weather and sea conditions that may only occur during limited windows of time. Many underwater archaeological sites have been discovered accidentally, by fishermen snagging ancient artifacts in their nets, by divers exploring reefs and happening upon underwater ruins, or by offshore construction projects inadvertently disturbing submerged cultural materials. These accidental discoveries have revealed tantalizing hints of what might exist beneath the waves, but they represent only the tiniest fraction of the total submerged archaeological record, and they are biased towards shallow depths and areas of intensive human activity where accidental encounters are most likely. The vast expanses of continental shelf that were exposed during the Ice Age and undoubtedly supported human populations remain almost completely unexplored archaeologically, representing enormous gaps in our understanding of human prehistory. Modern technology is beginning to address this challenge through the application of remote sensing techniques that can cover large areas relatively quickly and identify potential archaeological sites for later detailed investigation. Side-scan sonar creates images of the seafloor by bouncing sound waves off the bottom and measuring the strength and timing of the returning echoes, allowing researchers to identify anomalies like rock formations, shipwrecks, or possible man-made structures that warrant closer examination. Sub-bottom profilers use lower-frequency sound waves that can penetrate into the seafloor sediments, revealing buried features and stratigraphy that might indicate ancient land surfaces, river channels, or archaeological deposits hidden beneath more recent sediments. The multi-beam echo-sounding systems can create detailed three-dimensional maps of seafloor topography, revealing subtle features like ancient shorelines, terraces, or other geomorphological evidence of past sea levels and landscapes. By combining these various remote sensing techniques, underwater archaeologists can systematically survey large areas and identify the most promising locations for detailed investigation, making the search for submerged archaeological sites more efficient and productive than relying on accidental discovery alone. Once potential sites are identified, the next challenge is investigation and documentation, which requires different techniques depending on the depth, environmental conditions, and nature of the site. In shallow water where diving is practical, archaeologists can use modified versions of standard archaeological techniques including mapping, excavation, artifact recovery, and stratigraphic documentation. Though everything is more complicated underwater due to limited visibility, the need for diving equipment, the effects of currents and waves, and the logistical challenges of working in an environment where humans cannot breathe without assistance. Deeper sites beyond the range of conventional diving require remotely operated vehicles equipped with cameras, manipulator arms, and various sensors, allowing researchers to explore and document sites from the surface by controlling the robot through a tether that provides power and communication links. The most sophisticated underwater archaeological projects employ autonomous underwater vehicles that can navigate pre-programmed search patterns independently, surveying large areas and collecting data that researchers later analyze to identify features of interest. These technologies are expensive and require specialized expertise, limiting their application to well-funded projects targeting particularly important or interesting sites. But as technology improves and becomes more accessible, it will enable increasingly ambitious exploration of the world's submerged landscapes. The preservation of archaeological materials in underwater environments is complex and depends heavily on local conditions including water chemistry, oxygen levels, temperature, biological activity, and sediment characteristics. In general, organic materials like wood, leather, and fabric that quickly decay in typical terrestrial environments can sometimes be remarkably well preserved underwater, particularly in cold, low-oxygen conditions like those found in the Baltic Sea or the deep Black Sea where anaerobic conditions prevent the growth of decay organisms. Metal artifacts might corrode or might be preserved depending on the chemical environment, while stone tools and ceramics typically survive well, but might become scattered or buried, making them difficult to locate. Underwater sites also face unique threats from natural processes like currents and wave action that can damage or destroy remains, from biological organisms that consume or encrust artifacts, and from human activities including bottom trawling by fishing vessels, dredging for sand or minerals, offshore construction, and looting by treasure hunters seeking valuable artifacts for illegal sale. The challenge for underwater archaeologists is to locate sites before they are destroyed by these threats, document them thoroughly to preserve the information they contain even if the physical materials cannot be preserved, and in some cases conduct excavation and conservation to recover artifacts for study and museum display. Looking forward, the future of underwater archaeology and the exploration of ghost continents appears promising as technology continues to advance and as awareness grows about the importance of the submerged archaeological record for understanding human history. Several ambitious projects are currently underway or in planning stages to systematically survey large areas of continental shelf known or suspected to have supported human populations during the Ice Age, including intensive studies of Doggerland in the North Sea, surveys of submerged landscapes around Australia, where early Aboriginal populations would have lived before sea levels rose, and investigations of submerged sites around Southeast Asia and the South China Sea where evidence of Sunderland's inhabitants might be preserved. International collaboration is increasing as researchers recognise that submerged landscapes do not respect modern political boundaries, and that effective exploration requires sharing data, technology, and expertise across borders. New technologies including improved autonomous vehicles, advanced sonar systems, and even artificial intelligence for analysing remote sensing data promise to accelerate the pace of discovery, while growing public interest in underwater cultural heritage is leading to better protection and management of submerged archaeological sites. Within our lifetimes, we may witness discoveries that fundamentally change our understanding of human prehistory by revealing chapters of the human story that have been hidden beneath the waves for thousands of years, proving that ghost continents are not just geological curiosities, but rather missing pieces of the puzzle of who we are and where we came from. Throughout human history and across virtually every culture on Earth, stories and myths about catastrophic floods, drowned lands, and lost civilizations have held a prominent place in the collective imagination, serving not just as entertainment or religious teaching, but as frameworks through which people understand their place in time, their relationship to their environment, and the precarious nature of human achievement in the face of forces beyond human control. These myths take many forms and appear in many contexts, from the biblical story of Noah's Ark to the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, from Greek accounts of Atlantis and Deucalion's flood to indigenous traditions around the world describing how ancestral lands were drowned by rising waters, or how only a few survivors escaped great deluges that destroyed the old world. The persistence and near universality of flood myths has fascinated scholars for centuries, prompting theories and debates about whether these stories might preserve actual memories of real geological events, whether they emerged independently in different cultures as explanations for common observations like marine fossils found on mountainsides, or local flooding events extrapolated to cosmic proportions, or whether they spread through cultural diffusion from a common source and were adapted to local circumstances as they travelled from society to society. The psychological and cultural appeal of lost land myths appears to stem from several deep human tendencies and concerns that transcend particular cultures or historical periods. First, these myths speak to the universal human experience of loss and the knowledge that everything we build and everything we are will eventually pass away, whether through natural disaster, conquest, cultural change, or simply the relentless erosion of time. By framing this inevitable loss in terms of dramatic catastrophe, flood myths transform the abstract fear of impermanence into concrete narrative that can be understood, discussed, and perhaps even prepared for. Second, the myths often serve as moral tales, suggesting that catastrophes occur as punishment for human wrongdoing, particularly hubris, corruption, or forgetting one's proper relationship with divine powers or natural forces. This moral dimension provides meaning to disaster, transforming random suffering into comprehensible consequence and offering the hope that by living virtuously or correctly, one might avoid similar fate. Third, flood myths and lost land stories often function as origin narratives, explaining how the present world came to be by describing what happened to an earlier world. You're marking a boundary between past and present and providing a sense of historical identity and continuity, even while acknowledging radical discontinuity. The survivors of the flood become the ancestors of the current population, creating a direct link to the catastrophic past and suggesting that present conditions, however difficult, represent an improvement or at least a fresh start compared to the destroyed old world. The enduring fascination with Atlantis specifically, beyond just generic flood myths, demonstrates how a single story can capture something essential about human concerns and desires across centuries and cultures. Plato's account of Atlantis has inspired thousands of books, countless expeditions searching for the lost continent in locations ranging from the Mediterranean to Antarctica, to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, to Southeast Asia and beyond. Numerous films and television shows, and endless speculation about whether it was real, where it might have been, what technology its people possessed, and why it was destroyed. Different eras and different cultures have reimagined Atlantis according to their own preoccupations and anxieties, with Victorian-era writers often depicting it as a technologically advanced but spiritually decadent civilization destroyed by its own materialism. Early 20th century occultists transforming it into a spiritual paradise inhabited by psychically gifted masters who taught ancient wisdom. Had mid-20th century alternative historians proposing it as the source of all world civilizations whose advanced technology has been lost to modern understanding, and contemporary writers often using it as a metaphor for environmental catastrophe and the consequences of failing to live in harmony with nature. Each generation and each culture projects onto Atlantis whatever qualities it finds most meaningful or concerning, using the blank canvas of this legendary lost land to explore contemporary issues and to ask questions about what makes civilizations succeed or fail, what knowledge might be lost when civilizations collapse, and what warnings the past might hold for the present. Beyond Atlantis, other lost land myths have served similar functions in their respective cultures, providing frameworks for understanding catastrophic change and cultural discontinuity, while preserving what might be genuine historical memories of actual environmental disasters. The Aboriginal Australian peoples have oral traditions describing times when the coast was farther out, when areas now underwater were dry land, and when catastrophic floods changed the landscape. Traditions that in some cases appear to describe conditions during or immediately after the last ice age, when sea levels were rising along the Australian coast and drowning extensive low-lying territories. Some researchers have argued that these traditions represent the longest continuous cultural memories in human history, potentially preserving information about events that occurred 10,000 years ago or more through oral transmission across hundreds of generations. If true, this would suggest that human oral traditions are far more reliable and long-lasting than typically assumed by modern scholars, and that dismissing ancient flood myths as purely symbolic or imaginative might cause us to overlook genuine historical information preserved in narrative form. Similar claims have been made for flood traditions among Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples, Polynesian island cultures, and various other groups whose territories experienced dramatic environmental changes at the end of the Ice Age. The challenge in interpreting these myths and determining what, if any, historical reality they might preserve lies in distinguishing between different types of information that might be encoded in traditional narratives. Clearly, most flood myths include supernatural elements, moral teachings, and narrative elaborations that are not intended as literal historical description, but rather serve religious, social, or pedagogical functions within their cultures. The question is whether underneath these symbolic layers there might be a core of genuine memory about real events, preserved through the only medium available to preliterate peoples for transmitting information across generations, oral tradition in the form of stories, songs, and rituals that were deliberately maintained and passed from elders to younger generations as important cultural knowledge. Some elements of flood myths, such as the specific geographic details, descriptions of environmental conditions before the flood, or accounts of where survivors fled, might represent actual preserved information about Ice Age landscapes and post-glacial flooding, while other elements like divine intervention, supernatural animals, or magical solutions to survival challenges clearly belong to the realm of myth and symbol rather than historical memory. Learning to separate these strands is difficult and controversial, requiring careful collaboration between archaeologists who understand the physical evidence of past environments and disasters, anthropologists who understand how oral traditions function and change over time, and members of indigenous communities who maintain the traditions and can explain their cultural context and significance. The cultural impact of lost land myths extends into the present day through their influence on how we think about climate change, environmental degradation, and the possibility of civilizational collapse. The image of catastrophic flooding that destroys an entire civilization serves as a powerful warning about the consequences of environmental change, and it is frequently invoked in discussions about sea level rise, whether explicitly through references to Atlantis, or more generally through the language of cities drowning, coastlines disappearing, and landscapes being reclaimed by the ocean. This mythic framework shapes how we understand and respond to contemporary environmental challenges, providing a narrative structure that makes abstract scientific predictions about future climate impacts feel more immediate and emotionally resonant. At the same time, the association between lost lands and advanced ancient civilizations can sometimes lead to problematic thinking, where people imagine that previous catastrophes destroyed all evidence of sophisticated cultures, allowing them to speculate freely about ancient super-civilizations without needing to provide evidence and potentially distracting from the real and important task of understanding actual human history based on actual archaeological evidence. The cultural power of lost land myths is thus double-edged, capable of inspiring serious reflection on human vulnerability and environmental responsibility, but also capable of fueling pseudo-archaeology and baseless speculation that obscures rather than illuminates the past. The debate between catastrophism and gradualism, between understanding Earth's history as shaped primarily by sudden dramatic events versus slow, steady processes acting over vast periods of time, has been central to geological science for centuries and has direct implications for how we understand the formation of ghost continents and the drowning of landscapes. For much of the 19th century, geology was dominated by uniformitarianism, and the principle most famously articulated by James Hutton and Charles Lyell, which held that the same geological processes we observe today have operated throughout Earth's history at roughly the same rates, meaning that features like mountain ranges, canyons, and sedimentary layers formed through the accumulation of tiny changes over millions or billions of years rather than through sudden catastrophes. This uniformitarian view was partly a reaction against earlier catastrophist theories that attributed geological features to events like the biblical flood, and it proved tremendously productive for geology, providing a framework for understanding rock formations, fossil succession, and the immense age of the Earth. However, uniformitarianism in its strict form tended to downplay or dismiss evidence of catastrophic events, leading to a bias where geologists were reluctant to invoke sudden disasters even when evidence suggested they had occurred. Over the 20th century and into the 21st, geology has gradually developed a more nuanced understanding that recognizes both gradual processes and catastrophic events as important in shaping Earth's surface and history. The recognition that asteroid impacts have played a significant role in Earth's history, particularly the impact that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, demonstrated that catastrophic events can indeed have global consequences and leave clear geological signatures in the rock record. Similarly, the study of turbidity currents, underwater landslides, megafloods like those that carved the channeled scablands of Washington state, and other rapid geological processes has shown that not all geological change occurs slowly and gradually. In the context of sea level change and the drowning of landscapes, this more balanced view recognizes that while the overall trend of post-glacial sea level rise was gradual, occurring over thousands of years, this gradual rise was punctuated by episodes of much more rapid change during events like meltwater, Pulse 1A, and was locally complicated by sudden catastrophes like the Storegga tsunami that could inundate entire regions in hours rather than centuries. This synthesis of gradualism and catastrophism helps us understand the diverse experiences that different human populations would have had with drowning landscapes at the end of the Ice Age. For many coastal communities, the rise in sea level was probably so gradual that no individual would have noticed significant change during their lifetime, with the coastline retreating perhaps only meters per generation, slow enough that people simply adjusted by moving their settlements slightly inland periodically, without necessarily recognizing that they were experiencing a long-term trend rather than temporary variation. These populations might not have developed strong cultural memories of catastrophic flooding because they did not experience it as catastrophe, simply as gradual environmental change requiring modest adaptation. However, other populations experience much more dramatic flooding, either during the rapid pulses when sea level rise temporarily accelerated, or when local catastrophic events like tsunamis combined with the gradual trend to produce sudden disasters that destroyed settlements and forced rapid evacuation. These populations would have developed very different cultural memories, preserving stories of catastrophic floods that destroyed the old world, stories that might have been transmitted for generations and potentially contributed to the flood myths we find in later literate civilizations. The geological record supports both types of experience as real and important, with the gradual overall rise being the primary mechanism that drowned the continental shelves, but with punctuating catastrophes adding dramatic episodes that would have had disproportionate impact on human memory and cultural tradition. The question of how quickly sea levels can rise has taken on new urgency in the context of contemporary climate change and the need to project future impacts and plan adaptation strategies. Historical sea level rise at the end of the last ice age provides our best empirical evidence for how fast large-scale deglaciation can raise sea levels, with the overall rate averaging about 1 metre per century during the main period of post-glacial rise, but with much faster rates during pulses like meltwater pulse 1a when rates temporarily reached several metres per century. These historical rates are concerning when compared to current observations showing sea level rise accelerating over the past century, with satellite measurements documenting rates of rise that are increasing year by year as ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica melt faster and ocean warming accelerates. If current trends continue or accelerate, we might see rates of sea level rise this century that approach or even exceed the rates during the most rapid pulses of post-glacial rise, potentially creating conditions where coastal populations experience the kind of dramatic flooding within single lifetimes that ancient populations only experienced during catastrophic episodes. The ghost continents of the past thus serve as warnings about what can happen when ice sheets melt and sea levels rise, reminding us that the apparent stability of coastlines is temporary and that human settlements in coastal areas are fundamentally vulnerable to changes in the relationship between land and sea. Understanding the mechanisms and rates of past sea level change also helps us interpret the archaeological record and understand what kinds of sites we might expect to find on submerged continental shelves. If sea level rise was primarily gradual, then archaeological sites should be relatively well preserved, buried under sediment as the coast retreated inland and protected from wave action by their increasing depth beneath the surface. If rise was rapid and catastrophic, sites might show more evidence of destruction and disruption, with artifacts scattered, structures damaged, and stratigraphy disturbed by the sudden inundation. The combination of both processes suggests that different areas of the continental shelf should show different patterns of preservation, depending on their specific history of submersion, with some areas preserving intact archaeological landscapes essentially frozen in time, while others show evidence of violent disruption and rapid burial. Underwater archaeologists need to take this variability into account when planning surveys and excavations, recognizing that not all submerged areas have equal potential for revealing well-preserved sites, and that understanding the local history of sea level change and geological processes is essential for targeting the most promising locations for research. The science of how landscapes drown, combining gradual and catastrophic processes in complex patterns that vary from place to place, that directly informs the practice of finding and studying the ghost continents and lost settlements that resulted from these processes. Throughout history, human populations living in coastal areas have had to adapt to changes in sea level, coastline position, and the relationship between land and water, developing various strategies for responding to environmental change ranging from simple migration to elaborate engineering projects designed to hold back the sea. Understanding these historical responses provides context for appreciating both the challenges faced by ancient populations experiencing post-glacial sea level rise and the challenges facing modern coastal communities dealing with contemporary sea level rise driven by anthropogenic climate change. The most fundamental response to rising sea levels is simply to move, abandoning areas threatened by flooding and relocating to higher ground, inland or along other coasts not yet affected. This strategy was probably the most common response throughout prehistory and early history, when populations were relatively small and mobile, when unoccupied land was readily available for resettlement, and when people had not yet invested heavily in permanent infrastructure that would be costly to abandon. Archaeological evidence suggests that this kind of migration occurred repeatedly around the world as post-glacial sea levels rose, with coastal populations moving inland or along the coasts, sometimes displacing or absorbing existing inland populations and creating conflicts or cultural changes as refugees from drowning lowlands encountered peoples already occupying the territories to which they fled. As human societies became more complex and invested more heavily in permanent settlements, agriculture and infrastructure, the option of simply moving became less attractive and more disruptive, leading to efforts to adapt in place through various engineering and management strategies. Some of the earliest examples of humans trying to control water and protect settlements from flooding come from ancient Mesopotamia, where irrigation systems, levees, and other water management structures were essential for agriculture in the river valleys, but also served to control flooding and protect settlements. Ancient Egypt similarly developed sophisticated understanding of the Nile's flood cycle and built systems to manage water for both irrigation and flood control. These early hydraulic civilizations demonstrate that humans have been trying to control water and protect themselves from its destructive power for thousands of years, long before modern technology made possible the massive engineering projects that characterize contemporary flood defense systems. However, these ancient systems were limited in scale and effectiveness compared to modern capabilities, and they were designed primarily to manage river flooding rather than sea level rise, which presents different challenges because unlike river floods, which are temporary and seasonal, rising sea levels represent permanent change that cannot be waited out or adapted to with temporary measures. The Netherlands provides perhaps the most impressive historical and contemporary example of humans actively fighting against the sea and reclaiming land from water rather than simply defending against inundation. Beginning in the medieval period and continuing through to the present day, the Dutch have constructed elaborate systems of dikes, pumps, and barriers to protect low-lying land from the sea and even to drain bodies of water and convert them to agricultural land. Much of the modern Netherlands lies below sea level and would be uninhabitable without constant pumping to remove water that seeps through or over the dikes, representing a centuries-long commitment to holding back the sea through engineering and vigilance. This remarkable achievement demonstrates that with sufficient resources, technology, and social organization, humans can indeed defend against rising water and maintain habitation in areas that would otherwise be claimed by the ocean. However, the Dutch example also illustrates the costs and limitations of this approach, because maintaining the dikes and pumps requires constant investment. The system remains vulnerable to catastrophic failure if storms or other events overwhelm the defences, and the strategy only works because the Netherlands is a relatively wealthy country with the resources to invest in expensive infrastructure. Poorer regions facing similar challenges from sea level rise may not have the option of building Dutch-style defences, leaving their populations with the more ancient choice between accepting permanent flooding or migrating to higher ground. Contemporary responses to sea level rise are shaped by the reality that hundreds of millions of people live in low-lying coastal areas, many in megacities where retreat or evacuation would be extraordinarily disruptive and expensive, and where the economic and cultural value of the threatened areas provides strong motivation to defend them if possible. This has led to planning for massive coastal defence projects in threatened cities around the world, including proposals for seawalls, barriers, and other structures designed to keep water out even as sea levels rise by metres over the coming century. Some cities like Venice and London have already constructed major barrier systems to manage flooding, though these were designed primarily for storm surge protection rather than long-term sea level rise, and they may need to be upgraded or replaced as conditions change. Other cities are exploring more innovative approaches, including floating or amphibious architecture that can rise and fall with water levels, strategic retreat where some areas are abandoned and resources concentrated on defending others, and nature-based solutions like restoring wetlands and mangrove forests that can provide natural buffers against storm surge and flooding. The diversity of proposed solutions reflects both the variety of circumstances different cities face and the uncertainty about which approaches will prove most effective and sustainable over the long term. The challenge of responding to contemporary sea level rise is complicated by the long time scales involved and the uncertainty about how much and how fast sea levels will rise, depending on future greenhouse gas emissions and the response of ice sheets to warming. Planning coastal defences requires making decisions today about infrastructure that must function for decades or centuries into the future. But we do not know exactly what conditions the infrastructure will face, making it difficult to determine what level of protection is necessary or what investment is justified. Building defences adequate for worst-case scenarios might be extremely expensive and possibly unnecessary if those scenarios do not materialise, but building only for moderate scenarios might leave cities vulnerable if conditions turn out worse than expected. This planning challenge has no easy answer, and requires societies to make difficult decisions about how much risk to accept, how much to invest in protection versus adaptation, and how to balance the interests of current generations who bear the costs of building defences against future generations who will either benefit from those investments or suffer from their inadequacy. The historical record of humans responding to coastal change offers some lessons and examples, but ultimately contemporary society faces a challenge of unprecedented scale, because never before have so many people lived so close to sea level in cities with such enormous accumulated economic and cultural value at stake. How we respond will determine whether our descendants study early 21st century coastal cities as part of their present or as underwater ruins in another catalogue of ghost landscapes lost to the sea. When landscapes drown and territories are submerged, more than just physical land is lost. Cultural heritage, sacred sites, ancestral territories, agricultural lands, communities, and entire ways of life can disappear beneath the waves, raising profound ethical questions about responsibility, loss, preservation, and cultural survival that have no easy answers. These questions are particularly acute for indigenous peoples and island nations facing the contemporary threat of sea level rise, because unlike wealthy developed nations that might have resources to build defences or relocate populations, many vulnerable communities have limited resources and limited power in international systems, making them disproportionately affected by climate changes they did little to cause. The potential loss of entire island nations to rising seas within this century represents not just a humanitarian crisis of displaced populations, but also a cultural and political crisis, as these nations face the prospect of literally ceasing to exist as territories, raising questions about whether a nation can continue to exist without land, what happens to sovereignty and rights when territory is submerged, and how international law should handle the unprecedented situation of entire countries disappearing beneath the ocean. Island nations in the Pacific, including Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, and others have been among the most vocal advocates for strong action on climate change precisely because they face existential threats from sea level rise, with some low-lying atolls having highest points only a few metres above current sea level and facing regular inundation during high tides and storms even before accounting for future sea level rise. These nations have relatively small populations and contribute essentially nothing to global greenhouse gas emissions, yet they face losing everything due to the historical emissions of larger and wealthier countries, creating a stark injustice that has led to discussions about climate justice, climate refugees, and the responsibilities that high-emitting nations might have to assist vulnerable populations. Some island nations have begun planning for the possibility of complete evacuation, negotiating with other countries about accepting their populations as migrants. But such evacuations would represent the end of these nations as distinct entities and would likely lead to cultural assimilation and loss of languages, traditions, and identities that have been maintained for centuries or millennia. The prospect of becoming ghost nations whose territories have vanished beneath the sea, leaving only diaspora populations scattered among other countries, has motivated these nations to fight for ambitious climate action that might preserve their homelands, even as larger countries with more diverse interests have been slower to reduce emissions. The question of cultural heritage preservation becomes particularly complex when dealing with submerged sites and landscapes, because traditional approaches to heritage preservation assume that sites can be protected in place, managed for public benefit, and passed on to future generations in their original locations. Underwater heritage challenges these assumptions because submerged sites are inherently difficult to access, vulnerable to ongoing degradation from marine processes, and expensive to study and monitor. International law recognizes the importance of underwater cultural heritage through instruments like the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, which establishes principles for managing submerged sites and prohibiting commercial exploitation and looting. However, enforcement of these protections is difficult because underwater sites are often in international waters or in areas where multiple countries might claim jurisdiction, and because monitoring and preventing illegal activity underwater is much harder than on land where sites are visible and accessible. The result is that much underwater heritage remains vulnerable to treasure hunters, destructive fishing practices, and simple neglect, with sites being lost to science and public knowledge before they can be properly studied and their information recovered. For indigenous peoples whose ancestral territories were submerged at the end of the Ice Age, the situation is even more complex because these communities may have cultural connections to landscapes that disappeared thousands of years ago, but remain important in oral traditions, over spiritual beliefs and cultural identity. Aboriginal Australians, for example, have traditional knowledge about areas that are now underwater, describing them in stories and songs that indicate their ancestors lived there before the seas rose. These submerged territories are not just archaeological sites of interest to researchers, but rather parts of living cultural traditions and spiritual geographies that remain meaningful despite being inaccessible beneath the ocean. Questions arise about who has authority to study these sites, whether indigenous communities should have special rights or roles in managing research on submerged ancestral lands, how traditional knowledge can inform scientific investigation, and how to respect cultural values and sensitivities when dealing with sites that may have spiritual significance. These questions require careful negotiation between archaeologists, government agencies, and indigenous communities, balancing scientific interest in studying the sites, indigenous rights, and cultural concerns, and practical limitations on what can be done in underwater environments with limited resources. Looking forward, as climate change potentially creates new ghost landscapes through contemporary sea level rise, societies will need to develop frameworks for deciding what cultural heritage is important enough to try to preserve. What can be documented for posterity even if physical preservation is impossible, and what must be accepted as loss. Not everything can be saved or moved, and difficult decisions will need to be made about allocating limited resources among competing heritage sites and communities, all of whom have legitimate claims that their particular sites and traditions are important and worth preserving. These decisions have ethical dimensions because they involve value judgments about whose heritage matters, whose history deserves preservation, and whose losses deserve recognition and compensation. They also have political dimensions because decisions about heritage preservation can become entangled with questions of national identity, indigenous rights, international relations, and the allocation of climate adaptation funding. The ethics and politics of lost heritage will likely become increasingly prominent issues in coming decades as sea level rise accelerates and as more communities face the prospect of becoming the next chapter in the long history of ghostlands disappearing beneath the waves. Their stories joining those of Doggerland, Sunderland, and all the other landscapes that exist now only in memory, myth, and archaeological fragments recovered from the seafloor. As we emerge from this deep exploration of ghost continents and lost landscapes, as you drift in that peaceful space between waking and sleeping where thoughts flow like gentle currents and understanding comes without effort, let us gather together the many threads we have traced through time and water. We have journeyed from Plato's ancient account of Atlantis through the real but forgotten landscapes of Doggerland and Sunderland, from the ice-buried continent of Antarctica to the newly recognized submerged continent of Zealandia, from the drowned cities of the Mediterranean to the submerged coastal lowlands that once fringed every continent on Earth. We have examined the mechanisms by which lands disappear beneath the waves, the processes both gradual and catastrophic that transform inhabited landscapes into seafloor, and we have considered how human populations have experienced and responded to these changes throughout history. We have distinguished between real ghost continents supported by scientific evidence and imaginary ones like Lemuria and Mu that exist only in speculation and myth, learning the crucial importance of basing our understanding on actual evidence rather than wishful thinking or romantic fantasy. And we have looked forward to contemplate how climate change might create new ghost landscapes in our own future, us potentially drowning coastal cities and low-lying territories in an accelerated replay of the post-glacial flooding that reshaped coastlines 10,000 years ago. What emerges from this exploration is a profound understanding of impermanence, a recognition that even features as massive and seemingly eternal as continents exist in dynamic equilibrium with forces that can transform or destroy them given sufficient time. The ground beneath our feet, the coastlines we assume are fixed, the landscapes we consider as permanent parts of geography. All of these exist in their current forms only temporarily, subject to change through processes operating at timescales that exceed normal human perception, but that become obvious when we zoom out to view thousands or millions of years. The boundary between land and sea is not a fixed line drawn on maps, but rather a temporary position in an ongoing negotiation between water and rock, a negotiation whose terms change as ice ages come and go, as climates warm and cool, as tectonic forces shift continents and open or close ocean basins. Humans have always lived at this boundary, drawn to coasts by the resources and opportunities they provide, but this has meant living with the risk that the boundary might move, that the sea might advance or retreat, and that landscapes familiar to one generation might become alien to the next. The ghost continents remind us that this risk is not hypothetical, but real and recurring, part of the fundamental nature of our dynamic planet. The human dimension of ghost continents is perhaps the most compelling aspect of their story, because these are not just geological abstractions, but places where people lived, where communities were established, where cultures developed, where ordinary human dramas of life, struggle, achievement, and loss unfolded in landscapes that no longer exist above water. The people of Doggerland didn't know they were living on a doomed landscape any more than we know whether our own coastal cities might one day join the catalogue of drowned settlements. They built their homes, raised their families, developed their skills and traditions, and adapted to the gradual environmental changes they experienced without recognizing the long-term trend that would eventually overwhelm the entire region. When catastrophe came in the form of the Storega tsunami, they experienced it as disaster without precedent, some not understanding that it was merely the final blow to a landscape already marginal due to thousands of years of rising water. The survivors carried their memories and stories to new homes, and perhaps some echo of those traumatic experiences persists in the flood myths of northern European cultures, faint cultural memories of a time when the sea swallowed entire worlds, and only fragments of the old knowledge survived the transition to the new world beyond the water. We can learn much from these ghost continents about resilience and adaptation, about the remarkable human capacity to survive and rebuild after catastrophe, but also about the limits of that resilience and the real costs of environmental change. Every ghost continent represents not just lost land, but lost human potential, lost cultural developments, lost knowledge and traditions that vanished when their landscapes drowned. We can never know what innovations might have emerged from the cultures of Sunderland if they had not been forced to continually retreat inland, abandoning settlements and territories generation after generation for thousands of years. We can never recover the full details of life in coastal communities around the world during the Ice Age, because their remains lie scattered across continental shelves beneath sediment and salt water. The archaeological record we possess and the history we can reconstruct are biased toward inland areas and sites that happen to be located above the high water mark of post-glacial flooding. The ghost continents remind us that history is not just what happened, but also what evidence survived to tell us about what happened, and that vast portions of human experience might be lost simply because they occurred in the wrong places, places that later became inaccessible beneath the waves. Looking to our own time and the future we are creating through our choices about climate and energy, the ghost continents offer both warning and precedent. They warn us that coastal landscapes are vulnerable to sea level rise, that the process can unfold with devastating speed during catastrophic episodes, and that once begun, the transformation from land to sea can be difficult or impossible to reverse. They remind us that we're not the first humans to face dramatic environmental change, that our ancestors survived similar challenges when Ice Age climates shifted and seas rose, but they survived through mobility and adaptation that might not be possible in our modern world of fixed borders, massive populations, and expensive infrastructure that cannot simply be abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere. The precedent they offer is sobering. Sea level rise of more than 100 metres is not merely theoretical, but has actually happened in the relatively recent past, and could happen again if we fail to limit greenhouse gas emissions and prevent the collapse of remaining ice sheets. The landscapes we consider normal and permanent are normal only for the current interglacial period, and are permanent only until the next major change in climate or sea level. This perspective should inspire both humility about our place in Earth's long history and determination to preserve what we can of the world we have inherited. Not out of a belief that we can stop all change, but out of recognition that the pace and magnitude of change matters enormously for human welfare and for the survival of the communities cultures, and landscapes we value. As you drift now into deeper rest, let your last waking thoughts be of water and time, of continents slowly sinking into legend, of coastlines retreating through millennia, of civilizations that rose and fell in places that exist now only in scattered artifacts on the seafloor and in myths passed down through generations. Imagine the vastness of the ocean and the secrets it holds, the landscapes hidden just beneath the surface, the ancient shorelines and river valleys and forests that once existed in areas now inhabited by fish and covered by sand. Think of the people who lived in those places, people like us, with hopes and fears, with communities and families, with cultures and traditions, who woke each day not knowing that they lived in a doomed world, who went about their lives with the same sense of permanence and security that we feel in our own lives, never imagining that their entire landscape would one day disappear beneath the waves and become a ghost continent, a mystery for future generations to slowly rediscover and puzzle over. Their fate reminds us that nothing is truly permanent, that everything we build exists only temporarily, and that the only constants are change and the human capacity to remember, to tell stories, to pass knowledge forward, and to make meaning from the fragments that survive. Sleep now, and let these thoughts dissolve like mist over water, like memory fading into legend, like continents slowly sinking beneath the gentle, patient, eternal sea.